Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most heartbreaking paradoxes. Picture this, an era that invented romantic love as we know it, that wrote passionate love letters spanning hundreds of pages, that created the very idea of marrying for affection rather than arrangement. And yet, this same era produced the most emotionally distant husbands in recorded history. Men who lived under the same roof as their wives but remained complete strangers to them. Men who could command empires but couldn't say I love you to the woman sleeping beside them. How did the Victorians, who gave us Valentine's Day cards and engagement rings, also give us husbands who treated their wives like elegant furniture? Tonight, we're pulling back the heavy velvet curtains on Victorian marriage, and what we'll find might just explain why so many modern relationships still struggle with emotional intimacy today. So before we step into the candlelit parlours of 1800s England together, I have a small request. If you find yourself drawn into tonight's story, if something resonates with you, or makes you think differently about love and distance, would you consider subscribing to this channel? A like would mean the world to me, and if you feel moved to share your thoughts in the comments, I genuinely read every single one. Maybe tell me where you are right now as you listen to this. Are you in bed watching the shadows dance on your ceiling, on a night drive with streetlights passing by? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Now, dim those lights if you can. Let the world outside fade away. And come with me to a time when love and loneliness lived side by side in the human heart. The year is 1852. In a comfortable townhouse in London, a young woman named Catherine sits by the window, reading a letter for the 7th time. Her husband, Thomas, wrote it to her 2 years ago, before they were married. The paper is worn soft from her constant handling, and she knows every word by heart. My dearest Catherine, it reads, I count the hours until we are united. You are the light of my existence, the song in my heart, the very breath I draw. Without you, I am merely half a man, wandering through shadows. I long to share every thought, every dream, every moment of my days with you. Beautiful, is it not? The kind of declaration that would make anyone's heart flutter. Catherine keeps this letter in a small wooden box along with dozens of others, each more passionate than the last. They are proof, she tells herself, that her husband once loved her with the intensity of 1,000 suns. But here is the painful truth. Thomas is downstairs right now in his study, and Catherine has not had a real conversation with him in 3 weeks. Not about anything that matters, not about feelings or fears or hopes or dreams. This morning he spoke exactly 11 words to her. Good morning, the tea is cold, I shall return at 6 o'clock. Then he left for his office, just as he does every morning, and tonight he will return just as he does every evening, and they will eat dinner in near silence before he retreats to his study with a book and a glass of brandy. Catherine sometimes wonders if she imagined those letters, if perhaps she dreamed up a different man, a man who existed only in ink and paper, while the real Thomas was always this distant stranger who happens to share her surname. This is not a story about one unhappy marriage. This is a story about an entire generation of marriages, caught in a trap that nobody quite knew how to escape. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901 under the reign of Queen Victoria, gave birth to a fascinating contradiction. On one hand, it pioneered what historians call the Companionate marriage, the revolutionary idea that two people should marry because they genuinely liked each other, because they were companions and friends, not just economic partners fulfilling a social contract. Before the Victorians, marriage was primarily a business transaction. Your father arranged it, property changed hands, alliances were formed. Love, if it came at all, was considered a pleasant bonus, but hardly the point. The Victorians changed all that. They declared that marriage should be based on mutual affection, emotional satisfaction, and yes, love. Real, romantic, soul-stirring love. They wrote novels about it, poetry about it, gave it a pedestal in society. But here is where it gets interesting, in that particular way that history often does. The very same society that elevated romantic love to a sacred ideal also created rigid systems that made genuine emotional intimacy nearly impossible. The Victorians wanted love-based marriages, they truly did. They just had absolutely no idea how to maintain emotional connection once the wedding bell stopped ringing. Think about it. The courtship period for Victorian couples was often intense and emotionally charged. Young men and women wrote letters constantly because they were frequently separated during their engagements due to work and family obligations. These letters became the foundation of their relationships. People fell in love through words on paper, through the careful crafting of their inner worlds, through the exposure of hopes and vulnerabilities that they would never dare speak aloud. One Victorian woman kept a diary throughout her courtship, and in it she wrote, "In his letters, William is everything I could want. He speaks of his doubts, his aspirations, his very soul. I feel I know him more deeply than I have ever known another human being." 3 years into their marriage, she wrote, "William sits across from me at breakfast and I realize I do not know this man at all. The William of the letters has vanished, replaced by a polite stranger who discusses only the weather and the state of his investments. What happened? How did passionate letter writers transform into silent dinner companions? How did men who penned declarations of eternal devotion become husbands who could barely look their wives in the eye? The answer is not simple, because it never is when we are talking about matters of the heart. But one thing becomes clear when we dig into the historical record. Victorian men were not naturally cold or unfeeling. They were trained to be that way. Systematically, relentlessly, from boyhood through adulthood, they were taught that emotional expression was not just inappropriate but actually dangerous to their very identity as men. A Victorian advice manual from 1865, written for young men about to marry, contains this remarkable passage. "Upon marriage, a man must put away childish things, and chief among these is the excessive display of sentiment. Your wife will respect you more if you maintain a proper reserve. Remember that you are the head of the household, the pillar of strength. She looks to you for stability, not for tears or emotional outbursts. Save your tender feelings for your courtship letters, which you may continue to write on special occasions, but in person. Be the rock upon which she may lean." Read that again. Save your tender feelings for your letters. In other words, emotional vulnerability was acceptable in writing, in that abstract space where you were not actually face to peer, where you could maintain control, edit your words, present a curated version of your inner life. But in person, in the daily reality of sharing a home and a life, no, that required a mask of strength and reserve. The tragedy is that both men and women wanted intimacy. The letters prove it. The diaries prove it. But society had created a system where intimacy was supposed to happen before marriage, during that magical courtship period, and then somehow sustain itself on memories alone once real life began. It is rather like being given a beautiful meal once, being told it is the most important meal of your life, and then being expected to live on the memory of that meal forever after. The hunger does not go away. It only grows sharper with time. Now, some of you might be thinking, surely this was not everyone. Surely some couples found a way to bridge this gap, to maintain closeness despite the social pressures. And you would be right. There were exceptions. There are always exceptions. But the exceptions prove the rule. And the rule in Victorian England was this. A good husband provided financially, maintained his dignity, upheld his authority, and kept his emotions carefully locked away in a box that his wife might occasionally glimpse but never truly access. The saddest part? Many Victorian men genuinely believed this was love. They thought that by providing a comfortable home, by being faithful, by giving gifts and maintaining respectability, they were fulfilling their duty as loving husbands. They had no framework for understanding that their wives were slowly starving for the very thing the courtship letters had promised. Genuine emotional connection. A letter from a Victorian wife to her sister, discovered in an attic in Cornwall in 1998, contains these heartbreaking lines. "He is a good man, Jane. I want you to know that. He provides well. He does not drink to excess. He has never raised his hand to me, and yet I feel more alone now than I ever did as a spinster in father's house. At least then I had hope that someday someone would truly know me. Now I am known only as Mrs. Thompson, the wife of a respected man, but I myself am invisible." This is the paradox we are exploring tonight. An era obsessed with love that could not quite figure out how to sustain it. A generation of men who wanted to be good husbands, but had been taught that being a good husband meant being emotionally unavailable. A time when marriage was supposed to be the ultimate source of happiness, but so often became a source of profound loneliness for both partners. So what created this impossible situation? What forces shaped Victorian masculinity into something so incompatible with the intimacy that marriage requires? The answer lies in a series of social, economic, and philosophical shifts that all converged in the 19th century to create what we might call the perfect storm of emotional distance. And that is where our journey truly begins, because to understand why Victorian husbands were so distant, we need to understand the world that shaped them, the doctrines that defined them, and the silent suffering that eventually broke them. But that is a story for the next part of our journey, where we will explore the doctrine that split the Victorian world in half, creating a chasm between men and women that would take generations to bridge. We will talk about separate spheres, about how the Industrial Revolution did not just change where people worked, but fundamentally altered how they loved, how they connected, how they understood their very roles in each other's lives. Stay with me, because the story only gets deeper from here. Now, let me take you back to a specific moment in time that changed everything. The year is 1825, and something revolutionary is happening in England, though nobody quite realises it yet. A factory owner named Robert Owen has just moved his textile mill from the countryside into the heart of Manchester. It is a seemingly small decision, but multiply it by thousands of similar decisions happening across England, and you have the beginning of what historians call the Industrial Revolution. But what does a factory have to do with love? Everything, as it turns out. Absolutely everything. Before this moment, before factories became the beating heart of English economic life, most families worked together. Picture a weaver's cottage in the countryside. The husband operates the loom, the wife spins the thread, the children help with various tasks. Yes, there were gender divisions in the work, but everyone was in the same physical space. The husband might look up from his loom and catch his wife's eye. They might share a joke, discuss a problem, argue about something trivial. They were woven into each other's daily existence, quite literally. But then came the factories. And with the factories came something that seems obvious to us now, but was genuinely shocking to people at the time: the complete physical separation of men's work and women's work. Men left home at dawn and returned at dusk, spending 12, sometimes 14 hours in a world their wives would never see. A world of machines and noise and competition and, as the Victorians themselves described it, moral corruption. This is where we encounter one of the most influential ideas of the Victorian age: the doctrine of separate spheres. Now, doctrines can be dry things, can they not? Lists of rules that people nod at and then ignore. But this doctrine was different. This one sank into the Victorian psyche so deeply that it shaped not just how people behaved, but how they thought about themselves, how they understood their very purpose in the universe. The doctrine went something like this: men belong to the public sphere, the world of business, politics, law, commerce. This was, by Victorian understanding, a brutal world. A world of cutthroat competition, moral compromise, violence, both physical and economic. The marketplace, they believed, brought out the worst in human nature: greed, aggression, deception, a necessary evil perhaps, but evil nonetheless. Women, on the other hand, belonged to the private sphere, the home, the family, religion, moral education. The home was imagined as a sanctuary, a pure space unpolluted by the corruption of the outside world. And women were the angels guarding this sanctuary, the keepers of virtue, the protectors of everything good and decent in human civilization. Sarah Stickney Ellis, one of the most popular writers of the Victorian era, put it this way in her book from 1845. The man's power is active, progressive, defensive. He is eminently the doer, the creator, the discoverer, the defender. His intellect is for speculation and invention, his energy for adventure, for war and for conquest. But the woman's power is for rule, not for battle. And her intellect is not for invention or creation, but for sweet ordering, arrangement and decision. She must be enduringly, incorruptibly good, instinctively, infallibly wise. Wise not for self-development, but for self-renunciation. Wise not that she may set herself above her husband, but that she may never fail from his side. Let that sink in for a moment. The woman's wisdom is not for self-development, but for self-renunciation. Her entire purpose is to be the moral ballast for her husband, the pure counterweight to the corruption he faces daily in the public sphere. Now here is where it gets really interesting. This was not just some abstract philosophy. This became the foundation of Victorian law, Victorian architecture, Victorian city planning, Victorian everything. The historian Leonore Davidoff put it perfectly when she wrote that a masculine penumbra surrounded that which was defined as public, while women were increasingly engulfed by the private realm, bounded by physical, social, and psychic partitions. Psychic partitions. That phrase haunts me. Because what it means is this: the separation was not just physical. Men and women began to inhabit different mental universes, different emotional landscapes. They were living parallel lives that touched only at certain designated moments, like trains passing on adjacent tracks. Let me give you a concrete example. In 1850, a middle-class businessman named Henry Bradshaw kept a detailed diary, which his great-great-granddaughter donated to a museum in York in 2003. Henry worked as a solicitor in Leeds. His entries are fascinating because he describes his days with such precision. On a typical Monday, he writes, "Departed home at 7 o'clock, arrived at chambers by 8, met with Mr. Thompson regarding the disputed property boundary, then to court for the Henderson case, lunch at the club with Jameson and Wells, discussed the new railway proposal. Back to chambers for correspondence, dinner, meeting with potential clients, home by 9 o'clock, exhausted." And then this line, "Found Eleanor in the drawing room. She inquired about my day. I told her it was productive. She did not press further." She did not press further. Think about what is contained in that simple sentence. Henry has spent 14 hours in a complex world of legal disputes, business negotiations, political discussions. His mind is full of stories, challenges, frustrations, triumphs. Eleanor knows none of it. She cannot know it. It would be improper for him to burden her with the ugly realities of the public sphere. Her role is to provide refuge, not to engage with the very things he needs refuge from. But here is the cruel irony. Eleanor's day was equally complex, equally full of challenges. Managing a Victorian household was not some simple matter of arranging flowers and taking tea. She supervised servants, managed budgets, made decisions about food, clothing, medicine, education. She dealt with tradesmen, handled social obligations, nursed sick children. She had her own world of relationships and responsibilities and difficulties. But Henry knew nothing of this either. Her world was invisible to him because it was domestic, and domestic affairs were beneath the notice of a man engaged in important work. The doctrine of separate spheres did not just separate their physical locations, it made each of them incomprehensible to the other. Have you ever had that experience of living with someone and yet feeling completely alone? That's what I am talking about. That strange, aching loneliness that comes from sharing a space with someone who might as well be speaking a different language. The architectural historian Judith Flanders discovered something remarkable in her research. Victorian houses from the 1850s onward were increasingly designed with separate entrances, separate staircases, separate zones for men and women even within the home. The husband's study or library was his domain, often deliberately placed near the front door so he could come and go without disturbing the domestic sphere. The wife's morning room or sitting room was at the heart of the house, surrounded by nurseries and servants' quarters. Even in sleep, they were separated. Upper-class Victorian bedrooms often had two separate beds, sometimes even separate rooms connected by a door that the husband could knock on when he desired his wife's company. Desired in the most euphemistic sense, of course, which we will talk about in a later part of this story. The house itself became a physical manifestation of the doctrine. Love lived here, supposedly, but love fragmented into separate compartments that rarely overlapped. Now, some of you might be thinking, surely working-class families could not afford this separation. And you would be absolutely correct. A coal miner's wife in Durham could not sit at home being an angel while her husband laboured in darkness below the earth. She had to work too, often in the same mines or in factories, or taking in laundry or doing whatever was necessary to keep the family from starving. But here is the fascinating and rather sad part. The doctrine of separate spheres was so powerful, so aspirational, that even working-class families who could not live it out still believed in it. The historian Catherine Hall found that working-class men often expressed shame that their wives had to work, saw it as a failure of their masculinity, and working-class women often internalized the idea that a proper home should be a sanctuary kept by a woman who did not have to soil herself with outside work. The doctrine became a measure of success. If your wife could stay home, you had made it. You were respectable. You were a real man. The fact that most families could never achieve this ideal did not diminish its power. If anything, it made the longing for it stronger. And for those families who did achieve it, who could afford to live according to the doctrine? They discovered that success tasted like loneliness. The businessman who came home to his angel wife found that he had no one to share his actual life with. And the angel wife discovered that being placed on a pedestal is just another word for being isolated and ignored. There is a particularly heartbreaking letter from a woman named Margaret Oliphant to her friend in 1862. Margaret was a successful novelist, but she was also a wife and mother, and she wrote, "I wake in the morning in my comfortable bed, in my comfortable house, provided for by my comfortable husband, and I think, I could be anyone. He knows the character I play in his life, but he does not know me. How could he? He is away for the 12 hours each day when I'm most myself. When he returns, I must transform into the serene angel of the house, the refuge from his cares. There is no room for my cares in that equation. There is no room for me." No room for me. That is what the doctrine of separate spheres ultimately created. Two people living parallel existences, each performing a role, each increasingly unable to bridge the gap to reach the actual person on the other side. And the saddest part, both men and women bought into this system, not because they were foolish or unfeeling, but because they genuinely believed it was the right way to live. Men thought they were protecting their wives from the harsh realities of the world. Women thought they were providing their husbands with the moral and emotional sanctuary they needed. Both were trying to love each other, but the very structure of their society made that love impossible to express or receive in any meaningful way. The Industrial Revolution did not just change where people worked, it changed the fundamental architecture of intimacy. It took couples who might have spent their days side by side and scattered them into separate worlds, then told them this was progress, this was civilization, this was the proper order of things. And into this divided world came the next element of our story, a dramatic shift in what it meant to be a man, because the doctrine of separate spheres was just the beginning. What happened next would take the natural emotional distance created by physical separation and transform it into a moral imperative, a cornerstone of masculine identity itself. We are about to discover why Victorian men did not just become distant by circumstance, but by design, by training, by their very definition of what made them men in the first place. Something fascinating happened between 1837 and 1870. If you had asked a Victorian gentleman what it meant to be a man during those early years, he would have told you about earnestness, about sincerity, about spiritual depth. But ask that same question in 1890 and you would get a completely different answer. Strength, stoicism, absolute emotional control, an iron will that never bends, never breaks, never shows weakness of any kind. What changed? How did an entire culture's definition of masculinity transform so dramatically in just a few decades? The answer involves war, empire, religion, and a poet named Rudyard Kipling, who would write a guide to manhood so influential that people still quote it today without realizing they are channeling Victorian ideals. But let me start with a man who lived right in the middle of this transformation. His name was Arthur Hughes, and he kept a journal throughout his adult life, from 1855 until his death in 1903. His grandson found these journals in an attic in Bristol in 1978 and donated them to the University of Cambridge, where I had the pleasure of reading them years ago while researching another topic entirely. They stopped me in my tracks. In 1856, Arthur was 23 years old and about to propose to a woman named Isabel. He writes, "I find myself weeping at odd moments, overcome by the depth of my feeling for her. Yesterday I saw a robin in the garden and thought of how Isabel loves all small creatures, and tears came unbidden to my eyes. I am not ashamed of this. It is proof, I believe, of the earnestness of my attachment, the sincerity of my soul." Now jump forward 30 years, 1886. Arthur is now 53, a successful banker, father of 4. He writes, "Young Thomas came to me this morning, tears streaming down his face over some trivial matter with his schoolmates. I told him what my father should have told me. A man does not cry. I do not care what the provocation. Tears are for women and children. If he wishes to be respected in this world, he must learn to control himself. I gave him no comfort until he mastered his emotions. Only then did I speak with him about the matter at hand." The same man, the same journal. Two completely different philosophies about what it means to be male. In 30 years, Arthur transformed from someone who saw tears as proof of sincere feeling into someone who saw them as shameful weakness that must be ruthlessly suppressed. What happened to Arthur happened to an entire generation of Victorian men, and it did not happen by accident. Here is what you need to understand about early Victorian masculinity. In those first decades of Queen Victoria's reign, there was still room for feeling in the masculine ideal. Men were encouraged to be earnest, which meant sincere, deeply felt, spiritually aware. The influence of Romanticism was still strong. The poets Byron and Shelley and Wordsworth had made it acceptable, even admirable, for men to express powerful emotions, to commune with nature, to explore the depths of their own souls. But then something shifted. Several things, actually, all happening at once, all pushing in the same direction. First, there was the British Empire. By 1870, Britain controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land surface. Managing an empire that vast required a particular type of man. Not a sensitive poet who wept at Robins and Gardens, but a warrior administrator who could make hard decisions without flinching, who could maintain order in distant colonies, who could, if necessary, command troops into battle. The empire needed men who were, as the Victorians put it, war-ready. Physically fit, mentally tough, emotionally controlled. You cannot build and maintain the largest empire in human history with men who stop to contemplate their feelings. You need men who act, who command, who never show doubt or fear or vulnerability. And so began what historians now call the cult of physical fitness and athleticism. This was the era when bodybuilding emerged as a cultural phenomenon. A man named Eugen Sandow became one of the most famous people in England by touring the country, displaying his muscular physique like a living sculpture. Women fainted at his performances, but the real message was directed at men. This is what you should aspire to be: strong, powerful, a body that looked ready for combat at any moment. Along with physical strength came a religious justification. Have you heard the term muscular Christianity? It was coined during this period by writers like Charles Kingsley and Thomas Hughes, author of the famous novel Tom Brown's School Days. The idea was that Christianity was not meant to be soft or gentle or feminine. Jesus was a carpenter, they argued, a man who worked with his hands, who overturned tables in the temple. True Christianity required masculine vigour, physical courage, moral strength. Thomas Hughes wrote in 1857, "The least of the muscular Christians has hold of the old chivalrous and Christian belief that a man's body is given to him to be trained and brought into subjection, and then used for the protection of the weak, the advancement of all righteous causes, and the subduing of the earth." Notice the language. The body must be brought into subjection. Subduing. Protection through strength. This is a very different vision from the earnest feeling man of the earlier Victorian period. And then came the literature that would cement this new masculine ideal in the cultural imagination. In 1895, Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem called If as advice to his son. It became and remains one of the most popular poems in the English language. You've probably heard the opening lines, "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you." The entire poem is essentially a manual for stoicism. Keep your head. Do not show emotion. Trust yourself when others doubt you. Meet triumph and disaster with the same impassive face. The ideal man is one who remains completely level, completely controlled, no matter what storms rage around him or inside him. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. Beautiful language, is it not? Stirring even. But think about what it is actually saying. Your heart might break, your nerves might scream, your body might give out, but you must force them to keep going through sheer will. You must override your own humanity, your own suffering, and never let anyone see the struggle. This is the Stoic ideal. And by the late Victorian period, it had become the defining characteristic of proper masculinity. The historian Josephine Jobbins, in her research on Victorian public schools, found that by the 1880s and 90s, the phrase stiff upper lip had entered common usage. A real man kept a stiff upper lip. He did not tremble. He did not cry, he did not show fear or pain or grief or even excessive joy. Now here is where it connects to our story about marriage. Imagine you are a Victorian man raised in this later period. From the time you are a small boy, you are taught that emotions are weakness, that crying is shameful, that needing comfort or expressing vulnerability marks you as less than a man. You are sent away to boarding school at age 7 or 8, separated from your mother, placed in an environment where older boys bully younger ones as a matter of tradition, and where teachers believe that harsh discipline builds character. You learn very quickly to hide your feelings, because if you cry when you're beaten, the beating gets worse. If you admit that you are homesick, you are mocked mercilessly. If you show fear before a rugby match or an exam, you lose respect. So you learn to push everything down, to present a mask of confidence and control, to be the boy that Kipling would approve of. And then, years later, you fall in love. You write passionate letters to the woman you wish to marry. Letters where you can safely express feeling because you're not face to face, because you can edit and revise, because the written word provides distance and control. She falls in love with the man in those letters. But then you marry, and now you are expected to be the head of the household, the pillar of strength, the rock upon which the family depends. Everything you have been taught since childhood tells you that showing vulnerability to your wife would be a betrayal of your masculine duty. She needs you to be strong, does she not? She needs you to be the one who never breaks, who always has the answers, who provides certainty in an uncertain world. And so you become what you were trained to be, stoic, controlled, emotionally distant. Not because you do not love her, not because you do not have feelings, but because everything in your upbringing has taught you that love means strength, and strength means silence. Do you see the trap? The Victorian man was taught that the greatest proof of his love was his ability to bear his burdens alone, to never trouble his wife with his doubts or fears or struggles. Meanwhile, his wife was left wondering why the passionate man from the letters had vanished, replaced by this silent stranger who seemed to have no inner life at all. The poet Matthew Arnold, writing in 1867, captured this masculine crisis beautifully in his poem Dover Beach. He describes a world where the sea of faith is retreating, leaving behind only a darkling plain swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. And in the midst of this chaos, he turns to his beloved and says, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another." It is a plea for connection in a world that seems to be falling apart. But even as Arnold writes this plea, you can feel the restraint in it. Let us be true to one another, not let me tell you my fears or hold me while I tremble at the darkness. Just this stiff little phrase, let us be true, this is as close as a Victorian man could come to saying I am scared and I need you. A letter from 1879 found in the archives at Oxford shows this tragedy in miniature. A man named Edward writes to his brother, "I returned from the office yesterday to find Alice weeping in the parlour. Some matter with the servants had distressed her. I stood in the doorway uncertain. Every instinct told me to go to her, to offer comfort. But I found myself paralysed. What comfort could I offer? How does one comfort another when one has spent a lifetime learning to neither seek nor give such soft kindnesses? I retreated to my study. I am ashamed to admit it, but I did not know what else to do. Every instinct told him to go to her, but he stood paralysed. This is what the Stoic ideal did to Victorian men. It did not erase their capacity for feeling or their desire for connection. It simply made them unable to act on those feelings, unable to bridge the gap between what they felt and what they were permitted to express. And the cruelest irony, this stoicism was supposed to make men stronger, more capable, better able to handle the pressures of Victorian life. But it did the opposite. It isolated them. It trapped them inside themselves. It made intimacy impossible even when they desperately wanted it. The transformation from earnestness to stoicism, from feeling to control, happened over just a few decades, but its effects would last for generations. Even now, when we tell boys that big boys do not cry, when we praise emotional restraint as maturity, when we treat vulnerability as weakness, we are echoing these Victorian ideals. We are still living in the shadow of that shift that happened between 1837 and 1901. Arthur Hughes, in one of his final journal entries from 1902, wrote something that breaks my heart every time I read it. He was 70 years old, his wife had died the year before, and he sat down to look back on his life. He wrote, "I loved Isabel with all that I am, but I never told her so, not after those first years. I thought I was being strong for her. I see now that I was only being silent. I thought silence was strength. I know now it was only fear dressed up as virtue. If I could live it again, I would choose differently. But that is the privilege of the dying, is it not? To see clearly what we spent our lives refusing to look at. That sentence haunts me. I thought silence was strength. Because that is what an entire generation of Victorian men thought. They were wrong, but by the time they realized it, decades of silence had already built walls that could not easily be torn down. And those walls, they did not just appear fully formed in adulthood. They were built brick by brick, starting from the earliest years of boyhood, in institutions specifically designed to transform sensitive children into stoic men. We need to talk about the Victorian public school system because that is where the real training in emotional distance began, where boys as young as 7 were systematically taught to suppress every feeling, every need, every vulnerable part of themselves. Picture a September morning in 1867. A boy named Charles stands on a railway platform clutching his mother's hand. He is 8 years old. His trunk has already been loaded onto the train, filled with the uniform and supplies required by Harrow School, one of England's most prestigious boarding institutions. His mother bends down to embrace him one last time, and Charles feels something breaking inside his chest. He wants to cry. Every fibre of his being wants to bury his face in her shoulder and beg her not to send him away, but his father is watching. And his father has already told him 3 times this morning, "You are a Harrow boy now. Harrow boys do not cry." So Charles straightens his spine. He swallows the sob that is clawing its way up his throat. He shakes his father's hand like a little man, gives his mother a stiff nod and boards the train. Through the window he watches his mother dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. His own eyes remain dry. He's just learned his first lesson in being a Victorian gentleman, and he has not even reached the school yet. The Victorian public school system was not designed to educate boys. Oh, there was education happening, certainly. Latin and Greek, mathematics and history, all the usual subjects. But the real curriculum was something else entirely. These schools were factories for manufacturing a very specific product. Emotionally controlled, physically tough, absolutely unflappable men who would go on to run an empire without ever questioning whether what they were doing was right or whether the cost to their own humanity was too high. And the process began with systematic, emotional destruction. Let me be clear about something. When we say public schools in the Victorian context, we are talking about elite private boarding schools like Eton, Harrow, Rugby, Winchester. These were not public in the modern American sense. They were expensive, exclusive institutions for the upper and upper middle classes. These were the schools that trained future politicians, military officers, colonial administrators, business leaders. If you wanted your son to succeed in Victorian society, you sent him to one of these places, and if you loved your son, sending him there might be one of the cruelest things you ever did to him. A memoir published in 1923 by a man named Robert Graves, who attended Charterhouse School in the early 1900s, describes his first night away from home. He was 9 years old. He writes, "I lay in the dark dormitory listening to the sounds of other boys crying into their pillows. We'd all been warned that crying would be punished, so we tried to be silent about it. But you could hear the muffled sounds all around, like wounded animals trying not to make noise. After a while, even those sounds stopped. Not because the homesickness went away, but because we learned to cry without sound, or better yet, to not cry at all." Can you imagine? A room full of 9-year-old boys, all desperately homesick, all trying not to make a sound because expressing their pain would bring worse pain. This was not an accident. This was the system working exactly as intended. The cult of athleticism dominated these schools. Physical prowess was everything. A boy who excelled at cricket or rugby could be mediocre at his studies and still be admired. But a boy who excelled at studies while being poor at sports? He was scorned, bullied, sometimes violently so. The message was clear. The body matters more than the mind, strength matters more than sensitivity, and the ability to endure pain without showing it is the highest virtue. Thomas Hughes, in his novel Tom Brown's School Days, published in 1857, describes a ritual called tossing in a blanket, where older boys would throw younger boys in the air using a blanket, sometimes causing serious injuries. This was considered character building. When young Tom Brown witnesses this and shows distress, an older boy tells him, "You will learn that a boy must bear pain without complaint if he wishes to be worth anything. The sooner you understand this, the easier your time here will be." Bear pain without complaint. That phrase appears over and over in letters, memoirs, and school records from this period. It was the golden rule of Victorian boyhood. And the pain was real. Beatings were routine, not just from masters, though they certainly used the cane freely, but from older boys. The fagging system meant that younger boys were essentially servants to older ones, and if they failed to perform their duties adequately, or sometimes just because an older boy was in a foul mood, they could be beaten. And here is the truly insidious part. You were not allowed to tell anyone. Tattling was considered the worst possible offence. A boy who reported his abuse to a master or, heaven forbid, wrote home about it to his parents would find his life made absolutely miserable by the other boys. So you learned to endure. You learned that there was no comfort coming, no rescue, no sympathy. You learned that the only way to survive was to become hard, to shut down the part of yourself that needed gentleness or kindness or love. Winston Churchill attended Harrow in the 1880s, and he later wrote that he could count on one hand the number of times his parents embraced him throughout his entire childhood. His experience at boarding school was so traumatic that he would have nightmares about it for the rest of his life, and yet when he had sons of his own, he sent them to the same schools, because that was what you did. That was how you made a boy into a man. But what kind of man? A historian named J. A. Mangan spent decades researching Victorian and Edwardian public schools, and he documented something fascinating. These schools had an explicit philosophy they called good form. Good form meant maintaining composure in all circumstances, never showing surprise, fear, joy, or sadness beyond what was considered appropriate. Never appearing too eager or too interested in anything, because enthusiasm was unseemly. Never, ever admitting to physical pain or emotional distress. There are records of boys playing sports with broken bones because admitting injury would be poor form. Records of boys enduring serious illness without seeking help because complaining was not done. One account from Eton in 1890 describes a boy who continued attending classes for 3 days with appendicitis because he did not want to seem weak. By the time he collapsed and the situation became obvious, the infection had spread. He died 2 days later. At his memorial service, he was praised for his courage and good form. He was 14 years old. Now, you might be wondering, did parents not know what was happening? Were they not concerned about sending their sons into this environment? The answer is complicated. Some parents genuinely did not know the extent of the brutality. Communication was limited, and as I mentioned, boys who complained were punished. But many parents did know, at least in general terms, and they approved. They believed this harsh treatment was necessary to produce men of character. A letter from a father to his son at rugby school in 1872 survives in a private collection. The son had written home describing his loneliness and asking if he might come home for a visit before the scheduled holiday. The father's response is chilling. "My dear boy, I send you to rugby not to be comfortable but to be made strong. Comfort weakens the character. Loneliness teaches self-reliance. You must master these feelings, not indulge them. I expect no further letters of this nature. When next you write, I wish to hear about your progress in cricket and your standings in class, nothing more. Loneliness teaches self-reliance." There it is again, that Victorian conviction that emotional suffering is good for you, that it builds character, that learning to be alone and silent is somehow preparation for life. And in a way they were right. It was preparation for life, but not in the way they imagined. These boys were being prepared for a life where they would be isolated inside their own heads, unable to share their thoughts or feelings with anyone, including the women they would eventually marry. Think about it. You take a 7 or 8-year-old boy, tear him away from his mother and the only home he has ever known, place him in an institution where emotional expression is punished and physical toughness is rewarded. You keep him there for 10 years, the most formative decade of his life, with only brief visits home during holidays. You teach him that vulnerability equals weakness, that asking for help is shameful, that the only acceptable way to relate to other males is through competition or dominance or studied indifference. And then, at 18 or 20, you send this person out into the world and expect him to suddenly know how to form an intimate emotional bond with another human being. You expect him to be a loving husband, a present father, a man capable of tenderness and openness and trust. How is that supposed to work? The answer, of course, is that it does not work. The Victorian public schoolboy becomes the Victorian distant husband not because he lacks feeling, but because he has been systematically trained to suppress it, to view it as shameful, to equate it with everything weak and contemptible and unmanly. There is a memoir from 1935 by a man named Beverley Nichols, looking back on his time at Marlborough College in the early 1900s. He writes about the moment he fell in love with a classmate named Cyril. Nothing physical happened between them, you understand. This was Victorian England. But Nichols describes the intensity of his feelings, the joy of simply being near this person, the devastation when Cyril seemed to prefer the company of other boys. And then Nichols writes, "I learned a vital lesson during those years. I learned that the heart must be kept under lock and key, that allowing another person to see your need for them gives them power to destroy you. By the time I left Marlborough, my heart was sealed so tightly that I am not certain I have ever fully opened it since, not even to those I might have truly loved had I known how." The heart must be kept under lock and key. This was not just Nichols. This was the experience of thousands upon thousands of Victorian boys, learning that emotional intimacy was dangerous, that needing someone was weakness, that the only safe position was complete self-sufficiency. And here is what makes it even more tragic. These boys desperately wanted connection. The letters they wrote to each other, the friendships they formed were often intensely emotional. but they could not express it directly. Instead, they had to channel everything through acceptable outlets: competition, shared hardship, jokes that never quite said what they meant. The historian Peter Gay, in his extensive research on Victorian masculinity, found a pattern in the letters between boarding school boys. They developed elaborate codes to express affection without admitting to it. "I suppose you are well" meant, "I miss you terribly." The cricket match was tolerably amusing meant, "I wished you were there with me." "Do write when you have a moment" meant, "Please write immediately, I am desperate to hear from you." They were learning a language of emotional repression that would serve them for the rest of their lives, learning to say the opposite of what they meant, to hide feeling under layers of indifference, to protect themselves through distance. Now, imagine these boys growing into men and trying to communicate with wives who were raised in an entirely different emotional universe. Women who were encouraged to be expressive, to cultivate their feelings, to value emotional connection above all else. The wife says, "Do you love me?" and wants to hear genuine vulnerability, a window into his soul. The husband, trained for 15 years to never show vulnerability, responds, "Of course," in a tone that suggests the question itself is ridiculous. She interprets this as coldness. He thinks he's being reassuring through his steadiness. They are speaking different languages, and neither has the vocabulary to bridge the gap. A particularly heartbreaking letter from 1893, found in the estate papers of a family in Devon, shows this disconnect painfully. A wife writes to her sister, "I asked Frederick if he ever feels lonely. He looked at me as though I had spoken in Chinese. 'Lonely?' he said. 'I'm surrounded by people all day.' I tried to explain that I meant a different kind of loneliness, the kind that comes from having no one who truly knows you. He patted my hand and said I was being fanciful, but I saw something flicker in his eyes just for a moment. Recognition, perhaps? Fear? It was gone before I could identify it in, replaced by that pleasant, distant smile he wears like a mask. I wonder if anyone has ever seen Frederick's actual face. Because the Victorian public school did not just teach boys to control their emotions, it taught them to disappear behind a facade of good form, of pleasant neutrality, of carefully managed presentation. The real person, the vulnerable, feeling, knitting person, was buried so deep that sometimes even the man himself could not find him anymore. And these men, these products of the English public school system, went on to become the husbands, fathers, and leaders of Victorian society. They built railways and governed colonies and made fortunes in business. They were by all external measures wildly successful. But in their private lives, in their marriages, in their relationships with their own children, they recreated the same emotional desert they had learned to survive in as boys. They could not give what they had never received. They could not teach emotional literacy when they themselves had been trained in emotional silence. The schools had done their job too well. They had produced men who could keep a stiff upper lip through any circumstance. The tragedy was that any circumstance included their own marriages, their own families, their own hearts crying out for connection they no longer knew how to seek or provide. But the boarding schools were only part of the story, because even if a man somehow survived that system with his emotional capacity intact, Victorian society had other ways of ensuring he would become a distant husband. The economic pressures of being a breadwinner, the crushing weight of being the sole financial support for an entire family, created its own form of isolation. And that is where we need to turn our attention next, to understand how the role of provider became a cage that trapped Victorian men. There is a photograph that survives from 1878, taken in the offices of a London accounting firm. 15 men stand in neat rows, all wearing identical dark suits, all with the same serious expression. In the centre of the back row stands a man named George Ashworth. He is 32 years old. If you look closely at his face, you can see exhaustion etched around his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that suggests he is clenching his teeth. But his posture is perfect. His expression is composed. He looks like a man completely in control. What the photograph cannot show you is that George has not slept more than 4 hours a night in the past 6 months, that he leaves his house at 6 in the morning and rarely returns before 9 in the evening, that his wife is pregnant with their 4th child, and he lies awake calculating numbers in the dark, wondering how he will afford another mouth to feed, that 2 days before this photograph was taken, his employer threatened to dismiss him if his productivity did not improve, that the weight of providing for his family sits on his chest like a stone that grows heavier every single day. But you cannot see any of that in the photograph, because a Victorian man did not show weakness. A Victorian man bore his burdens alone, and a Victorian man's worth, his entire identity as a man, was measured by one thing above all else: his ability to provide money. Let us talk about money, because it is impossible to understand Victorian emotional distance without understanding the economic terror that governed these men's lives. We have talked about separate spheres, about stoicism, about boarding schools, but underneath all of that there was something more fundamental, the crushing pressure of being the sole financial support for an entire household, in an era with no social safety net, no unemployment insurance, no retirement plans, no way to catch you if you fell. The Victorian middle-class man lived on a knife's edge, and he was not allowed to show that he was bleeding. Here is what you need to understand about Victorian economics. For a middle-class family to maintain respectability, to remain in their social class, the wife could not work outside the home. We talked about the doctrine of separate spheres, but it was not just philosophy, it was economic reality. A wife who worked was proof that her husband had failed as a provider. It marked the entire family as working class, as struggling, as not quite respectable. So the husband carried it all, everything, the house rent or mortgage, the servants' wages, because even middle-class families were expected to employ at least 1 or 2 servants, the children's education, the appropriate clothing for every family member, because appearance mattered desperately in a society that judged your worth by your presentation. The food, the coal for heating, the gas for lighting, the doctor's bills when someone fell ill, the endless parade of expenses that came with maintaining a respectable Victorian household. And he carried it alone, because asking for help would be admitting failure. Borrowing money from family was shameful. Discussing financial difficulties with your wife was considered cruel, a burden she should be shielded from. Your friends and colleagues could never know if you were struggling, because weakness was blood in the water, and there was always someone ready to take your position if you faltered. A remarkable document surfaced in the archives of a Manchester bank in 2006. It is a ledger book kept by a clerk named William Foster from 1861 to 1889. Every week, sometimes every day, William recorded not just his expenses but his fears. These annotations appear in tiny script in the margins, words he clearly never intended anyone to see. Rent due in 3 days. Do not have it. Cannot sleep. Jonathan needs new boots. Where will the money come from? Saw Jenkins dismissed today for declining profits in his department. His wife and children were waiting outside to walk home with him. The look on his face, could that be me? Sarah asked why I seem distant. How do I explain that I am calculating numbers every moment we sit together? That when I look at her, I see pounds and shillings, costs and deficits. She thinks I do not love her. I love her so much that the terror of failing her keeps me awake every night. That last entry. Read it again. She thinks I do not love her. I love her so much that the terror of failing her keeps me awake every night. This is the paradox of the Victorian provider. His love expressed itself through anxiety, through obsessive calculation, through emotional absence caused by financial terror, and to his wife, it just looked like he did not care. The economic structure of Victorian marriage created an impossible situation. The husband's masculinity was defined by his ability to provide. If he succeeded, he was a real man, worthy of respect. If he failed, he was worthless. There was no middle ground, and the fear of failure was constant, relentless, consuming. Because here is the thing about Victorian business, it was brutally unstable. Companies went bankrupt overnight. Investments failed. Economic depression swept through regularly. In 1873, a financial crisis began that lasted 6 years. Banks collapsed. Businesses shuttered. Men who had been comfortable 1 month were destitute the next. And for a Victorian man, financial ruin was not just inconvenient. It was existential annihilation. If you lost your position, if your business failed, if you could no longer provide, you were no longer a man. Your wife lost respect for you. Your children were ashamed. Your friends avoided you. Society dismissed you. You had failed at the one thing that mattered. So Victorian men worked themselves to death. Literally. Records from insurance companies in the 1880s show that middle-class men died on average 10 years younger than their wives. Heart disease, strokes, what the Victorians called nervous exhaustion, but what we might recognise as stress-induced illness. They died at their desks. They died on trains coming home from work. They died in their studies late at night, still going over account books and business correspondence. And even if they did not die, they aged rapidly. Photographs from the era show men in their 40s who look 60, their faces carved with stress, their bodies bent from tension over work. There is a saying from the period, "A man is as old as his worries make him." Victorian men had a lot of worries. Now imagine coming home from this. Imagine spending 14 hours dealing with impossible pressures, calculating whether you can afford your children's school fees, wondering if your employer will decide you're expendable, carrying the knowledge that one wrong decision could destroy everything you have built. And then you walk through your front door and your wife wants to discuss her day, wants emotional connection, wants you to be present and engaged, but you cannot be present. Your mind is still at the office, still running numbers, still in survival mode, and you have been taught since childhood that discussing your worries would be burdening her, that admitting fear would be unmanly, that your role is to be the rock of stability no matter what storms rage inside you. So you say, "The day was fine, dear," and retreat to your study with a brandy and the evening paper. Not because you do not love her, but because you are exhausted, terrified, and completely unable to share any of it. A letter from 1882 captures this perfectly. A wife named Dorothy writes to her mother, "I asked Harold about his work today, as I do every evening. He gave me the same response he always gives. Everything is going well, nothing of interest to report, but I found an unopened letter from his employer on his desk marked urgent. When I mentioned it at dinner, he became angry with me for the first time in our marriage. Told me his business affairs were not my concern. Mother, I am not a fool, I know something is wrong, but he will not let me help, will not let me in. It is like living with a statue that occasionally speaks pleasantries." Living with a statue that occasionally speaks pleasantries, because that is what economic pressure combined with emotional repression created. Men who were physically present but mentally and emotionally absent, trapped in a prison of their own fears that they could not acknowledge or share. The historian John Tosh, in his book A Man's Place about Victorian masculinity, found something fascinating in his research. he discovered that Victorian advice manuals consistently told men that discussing business worries with their wives would destroy the sanctity of the home. The home was supposed to be a refuge from the brutal world of commerce. Bringing that world into the home through conversation would pollute it, would strip away the very thing that made it valuable. But think about what that means in practice. It means a man spends the majority of his waking hours in one world, the world where his identity and worth are defined, where his fears and struggles live. And then he must completely wall off that world when he enters his home, must present a false face of calm and contentment, must pretend that everything is fine even when it is falling apart. How is that sustainable? How is that healthy? How does that not create distance? The answer, of course, is that it is not sustainable, not healthy, and absolutely creates distance. Victorian men were living double lives not in the scandalous sense, but in the sense that they had to split themselves into two incompatible versions, the struggling, anxious man of the workplace and the composed, untroubled man of the home. The exhaustion of maintaining that split was immense, and it got worse as families grew. Because children were expensive and Victorian middle-class families tended to be large, 4, 5, 6 children was normal. Each child represented another mouth to feed, another set of clothes to buy, another school tuition to pay. Each child increased the stakes of the provider role. You were not just supporting a wife now, you were supporting a small tribe of people who depended entirely on your ability to earn money. The weight of it was crushing. A man named Edmund Thornton kept a diary throughout the 1890s, and one entry from 1893 reads, "Looked at my sleeping children tonight. 4 beautiful faces, 4 futures I am responsible for, 4 potential failures if I am not strong enough, smart enough, lucky enough. The love I feel for them is so vast it terrifies me. How do I ensure they have what they need? How do I guarantee I will not fail them? I cannot, and that knowledge follows me everywhere. 4 potential failures. Not 4 beloved children, but 4 walking reminders of all the ways he could fail as a man." This is what the provider role did to Victorian fathers. It turned love into terror, turned family into pressure, turned home into just another place where his adequacy would be measured and potentially found wanting. Have you ever felt the weight of being responsible for other people's survival? Even in our modern era, with social support systems and 2-income households, it can be overwhelming. Now imagine that weight multiplied, with no safety net, no backup plan, no acceptable way to express the fear it creates. That was the daily reality for Victorian men. And the cruelest part? Their wives often had no idea. The separate spheres doctrine meant that financial matters were completely opaque to women. A wife might not know how much her husband earned, what their actual expenses were, whether they were secure or teetering on the edge of ruin. She was deliberately kept ignorant of these matters, supposedly for her own peace of mind. So when her husband seemed distant and preoccupied, when he snapped at trivial things or buried himself in work or retreated into silence, she had no context for understanding why. She just knew that the man she married had become a stranger who seemed to carry the weight of the world but refused to tell her what that world contained. A particularly poignant letter from 1876 shows the gap between husband and wife's understanding. Found in a collection donated to the Women's Library in London, it is from a woman named Victoria to her best friend. Robert seems aged beyond his years. There is grey in his hair that was not there 6 months ago. He startles at sudden noises. Sometimes I catch him staring into nothing with such a look of despair that it frightens me. But when I ask what troubles him, he insists all is well. He provides for us beautifully. Our home is comfortable. The children want for nothing. So why does he seem like a man being slowly crushed by invisible weights? What am I failing to see? What am I failing to give him that he needs? What am I failing to give him? She thinks she is the problem. She thinks his distance means she is inadequate as a wife, because she cannot see the economic terror that governs his every waking moment, cannot understand that his distance has nothing to do with her, and everything to do with a system that placed impossible demands on men and then forbade them from admitting the impossibility. The Victorian economic structure created emotional distance by design, by making the husband solely responsible for financial survival, by forbidding wives from understanding or participating in financial matters, by defining masculine worth entirely through economic success, by providing no outlet for fear or struggle or doubt. The system guaranteed that men would be isolated inside their own anxiety, and that anxiety calcified into distance. The husband could not be vulnerable because vulnerability meant admitting he might not be able to provide. He could not share his fears because his fears were about failing the very people he would be sharing them with. He could not rest or relax because relaxation meant not working, not planning, not preparing for the next crisis that was surely coming. So he became what he had to become, a machine for earning money, a facade of competence, a statue that occasionally speaks pleasantries, not because he wanted to be, but because the alternative was unthinkable. And all of this crushing economic pressure and the emotional silence it created was happening while Victorian society simultaneously insisted that marriage should be a partnership of souls, a meeting of hearts, a source of comfort and intimacy and emotional fulfillment. The contradiction was maddening. How do you have emotional intimacy with someone when you cannot discuss the thing that occupies your mind every waking moment? How do you be vulnerable when vulnerability could destroy the very foundation of your masculine identity? The Victorian husband was asked to be two impossible things at once: the emotionally available companion and the unshakable economic provider. And when those two roles came into conflict, which they inevitably did, the provider role always won. Because you could survive a distant marriage, you could not survive financial ruin. But there was one relationship where Victorian men were supposed to balance these impossible demands differently. One role where they were expected to be both authority figure and emotional presence, both distant and involved, both stern and loving. We need to talk about Victorian fathers, about the particularly complicated dance of providing for children while being told that raising them was not really your domain. In a nursery in Kensington, on a January evening in 1881, a scene plays out that would be repeated in thousands of Victorian homes. The clock strikes 6. A 5-year-old girl named Beatrice has been waiting for this moment all day, dressed in her best frock, her hair carefully brushed by her nanny. Because at 6 o'clock she and her 2 brothers are permitted to visit their father in the drawing room, they descend the stairs in perfect silence. They have been warned. No running, no shouting, no disorder. Father has had a long day at the office and requires peace. The children line up outside the drawing room door. The nanny straightens collars, checks for smudges, reminds them once more. Speak only when spoken to, and address father as Sir. The door opens. Their father sits in his chair by the fire, newspaper in hand. He looks up and something softens in his face for just a moment. "Ah, the children," he says. "Come here. Let me see how you have grown." Beatrice rushes forward, then catches herself, slows to a proper walk. She wants to climb into his lap to tell him about the bird's nest she found in the garden, about the new book her governess read to them, about everything she has been saving up all day. But his posture is formal, his smile kind but distant, so she curtsies instead and says, "Good evening, sir. I hope your day was pleasant." 45 minutes later, the nanny appears at the door. Time is up. The children are ushered back to the nursery. Beatrice's father returns to his newspaper. Another day of fatherhood completed. Another day of feeling like a performer in a play where everyone knows their lines, but nobody knows what the play is supposed to mean. This is Victorian fatherhood. Simultaneously the most important role a man could have, and the role he was least equipped to actually fulfill. Because according to the doctrine of separate spheres, children belong to the private domestic realm. That was the mother's domain. Raising children, nurturing them, seeing to their daily needs, that was women's work. And yet the father was supposed to be the head of the household, the ultimate authority, the person whose approval mattered most. How do you be the most important figure in your children's lives while also being mostly absent from them? That was the impossible contradiction at the heart of Victorian fatherhood. The historian Leonore Davidoff found in her research that Victorian fathers occupied what she called an ambiguous position in family life. Fatherhood was theoretically central to domesticity, proof of a man's commitment to his home and family. But the actual work of parenting, the daily interactions and emotional labour of raising children, was considered beneath masculine dignity. So Victorian fathers existed in a strange liminal space, too important to be ignored, too removed to be truly known. Let me give you some concrete numbers that show just how limited father-child interaction was. A time use study from 1896, conducted by social reformers trying to understand middle-class family life, found that fathers in professional occupations spent an average of 30 to 45 minutes per day in the same room as their children, and most of that time was the formal evening visit we just described, where children were displayed like well-behaved ornaments and then dismissed. Upper-class fathers saw their children even less. There are accounts of aristocratic children who met their fathers only at breakfast and occasionally at dinner, and who had to make appointments through servants if they needed to speak with him about anything important. Some fathers were so distant that their children would not recognize them if they passed on the street. And here is where it gets truly heartbreaking. Many Victorian fathers desperately wanted closer relationships with their children. The letters and diaries survive to prove it. But they had no model for how to achieve closeness while still maintaining the authority and distance that masculinity required. A letter from a Victorian father named Stephen Gladstone to his brother in 1874 captures this tension perfectly. I watch little Helen playing in the garden, and my heart swells with such affection that I can barely contain it. I want to run out there, to gather her up, to hear about her games and her thoughts. But what would the servants think? What example would I set? A father must maintain dignity. He must be respected, not familiar. And so I watch from the window and I wonder if she will remember me at all when she is grown, or if I will be just a stern figure she had to curtsy to before being sent back to the nursery. A stern figure she had to curtsy to. That is what Victorian fatherhood often reduced to. Formal authority without genuine connection, power without intimacy. Now, the father's main involvement in child-rearing came through discipline. That was considered properly masculine. While mothers handled the day-to-day care and moral instruction, fathers were called in for serious infractions, for punishment, for demonstrating the consequences of disobedience. So often the primary association children had with their fathers was fear. The right to physically discipline children was considered fundamental to paternal authority. Beating was not just permitted but recommended by advice manuals of the era. Spare the rod and spoil the child was taken quite literally. A father who did not beat his children was considered weak, too soft, failing in his duty to shape their characters through firm discipline. But think about what that creates in terms of emotional connection. If the main time your children interact with you is when they're being punished, what kind of relationship develops? Not warmth, Not trust. Respect, perhaps, but the kind of respect that is really fear wearing a more acceptable name. A memoir written in 1932 by a woman named Harriet Marden, looking back on her Victorian childhood, contains this devastating passage. "I cannot remember my father ever touching me except to correct me. His hand was the instrument of discipline, never of affection. When I see modern fathers embracing their children, tossing them in the air, playing with them on the floor, I feel a kind of grief for what I never knew. I loved my father, I think, but I loved him the way one loves a distant king, with reverence from afar, not with the easy warmth of genuine affection." Reverence from afar. That captures it perfectly. Victorian children were taught to revere their fathers, to obey them absolutely, to seek their approval above all else. But they were not taught to know them as actual human beings, and their fathers were not given permission to be known. There was one activity where fathers were expected to be involved: gift-giving. Victorian fathers expressed affection through material provision. Christmas became an elaborate ritual of paternal generosity, with fathers presenting carefully chosen gifts to each child. Birthdays were celebrated with similar formality. The father was the source of treats and treasures, the provider of good things. And here is the interesting part. This often created resentment in mothers. Because mothers did all the daily work of child-rearing, but fathers got all the glory for giving gifts. A letter from a Victorian mother to her sister in 1883 reads, "John presented each child with a beautiful toy yesterday. You should have seen their faces light up, heard them thank Papa with such enthusiasm, and I thought bitterly of all the nights I sit with them when they are ill, all the hours I spend teaching and comforting and caring. But Papa gives them a toy once a month, and he is their hero. The father as hero and stranger simultaneously, revered but unknown, the most important figure in the household and yet somehow peripheral to the actual daily life of the family." Now, there were differences in how fathers related to sons versus daughters. Sons were groomed to follow in their father's footsteps, to eventually enter the public sphere themselves. So fathers paid more attention to sons, or at least they felt obligated to. A father was expected to direct his son's education, to teach him about business or politics, to prepare him for manhood. But even this often remained quite formal. The historian John Tosh found in his research that fathers and sons typically communicated through what he called directed activities. They might discuss the boy's progress at school, review his marks, talk about which career path he should pursue. But personal conversations, emotional exchanges, genuine vulnerability, those were absent. Daughters, meanwhile, were expected to serve their fathers, to pour his tea, to be charming and pleasant at dinner, to sing or play piano for his entertainment or when guests visited. The relationship was performative on both sides. She performed femininity, he performed paternal approval. Neither particularly knew the other beyond the roles they played. A particularly revealing document came to light in the archives at Oxford in 2010. It is a letter from a daughter to her father after his death, a letter she never sent but kept among her private papers. She wrote it in 1897, and it reads, "Dear Papa, you've been dead 3 months now, and I find I am mourning not the man you were, but the man I wished you were. I mourn that fantasy father before you even died, mourned him my entire childhood. You were there, physically present, but you never truly saw me. I wonder if you saw anyone really, or if we were all just roles to you, the obedient son, the dutiful daughter, the devoted wife. Did you ever want more? Did you ever feel the distance between us and ache from it the way I did? Did you ever feel the distance and ache from it? Because that is the question, is it not? Did Victorian fathers suffer from their emotional distance from their children as much as their children suffered from it? The evidence suggests they did. That letter I mentioned earlier from Stephen Gladstone watching his daughter from the window continues, "Sometimes I wonder what I have gained by maintaining this distance. Respect, yes. Authority, certainly. But at what cost? She will grow up and marry and leave, and I will have missed her childhood entirely. Not because I was absent, but because I was present in entirely the wrong way." Present in entirely the wrong way. That might be the saddest epitaph for the Victorian fatherhood. These men were there in their homes, in their children's lives, but they were trapped behind barriers of formality and masculine expectation that made real connection impossible. And those barriers were reinforced from all sides. If a father tried to be more involved, more affectionate, more present in his children's daily lives, he risked mockery. Other men would question his masculinity. His wife might worry that he was interfering in her domain. Society would see him as peculiar, probably weak. The social anthropologist Judith Flanders discovered advice manuals from the 1880s that explicitly warned fathers against being too familiar with their children. One states, "A father who plays on the floor with his children, who involves himself in their nursery games, who speaks to them as friends rather than as a benevolent authority, risks losing their respect. Children need to see their father as elevated, as someone to aspire to become, not as a playmate who descends to their level." Descends to their level. As though loving your children required descending, as though being playful or affectionate was somehow lowering yourself. But here is what makes this even more complicated. By the 1870s and 80s, after 1870 specifically, there was a shift happening in how people thought about children. Before this, children were often seen as small adults who needed to be shaped and controlled. But new ideas about childhood, as a special, innocent phase of life, were emerging. Suddenly, there was more emphasis on children's happiness, on creating positive memories, on childhood as something precious. This created additional pressure on fathers. Now they were supposed to be authority figures and creators of happy childhood memories. Distant disciplinarians and beloved patriarchs. It was another impossible contradiction. Some fathers tried to navigate this by having separate relationships with their children at different times. Formal during the evening visit, but perhaps slightly more relaxed on weekend outings or holidays. A sort of compartmentalized fatherhood, where different versions of the father appeared in different contexts. But children are not fooled by compartmentalization. They see the tension, they feel the inconsistency. A man named Geoffrey Hutchinson, writing his memoirs in 1945 about his Victorian childhood, describes his confusion. Father was stern and distant during the week, rarely speaking to us beyond necessary instructions, but on Sunday afternoons in summer, he would sometimes take us to the park and suddenly become almost playful. He would point out birds, make little jokes, even smile, and then Monday would come, and he would be the stern figure again, as though those Sunday afternoons had never happened. I never understood which version was real, or if either of them was. Which version was real? That is the question Victorian children constantly ask themselves, and the answer, the sad answer, is that both versions were real, or neither was, because their fathers were trapped in a system that would not let them be fully human, fully present, fully themselves. The impact of this distant fatherhood echoed through generations. Those children who grew up with formal distant fathers often became formal distant fathers themselves. They knew no other way. Even if they had vague longings for something different, they had no model to follow, no permission from society to be different. We talk about intergenerational trauma now, about how patterns repeat through families. Victorian emotional distance was perhaps one of the most widespread forms of intergenerational trauma in modern history. Millions of children raised by emotionally absent fathers, who then became emotionally absent fathers themselves, passing down silence and distance like a bitter inheritance. But here is where the story gets interesting. Because wives and mothers were watching all of this, they saw their husbands' distance from the children, they felt their own husband's distance from them, and they were beginning to have opinions about it. The Victorian marriage had always been unequal, but it was based on a certain unspoken bargain. The husband provided authority and financial support, the wife provided moral guidance and emotional support. But increasingly, wives were realizing that this bargain was fundamentally broken. They were giving emotional support but receiving none in return, and that realization would have consequences that would shake Victorian marriage to its foundations. Consider the peculiar role of the Victorian wife, and you begin to understand one of history's strangest job descriptions. She was called the angel in the house, a phrase that sounds lovely until you realize what it actually meant. An angel, after all, is not quite human. Angels do not have needs of their own. They exist solely to serve, to comfort, to guide others toward goodness. They float above earthly concerns, pure and untouchable, and fundamentally separate from the messy reality of human emotion. That was what Victorian wives were supposed to be, and the man who came up with this particularly cruel bit of poetry was named Coventry Patmore, who published a long poem with that exact title in 1854. It became one of the most influential texts of the Victorian era, shaping how an entire generation thought about wives and marriage. Let me read you a few lines, because they are worth hearing. Man must be pleased, but him to please is woman's pleasure. That is the core philosophy right there. The wife's entire purpose, her pleasure even, comes from pleasing her husband. She has no independent desires, no separate self. She exists as a reflection of his needs. But here is what makes this particularly insidious. The poem does not just say the wife should serve her husband. It elevates that service to something spiritual, something sacred. The wife becomes a kind of household saint, morally superior to her husband, precisely because she has no self, no ego, no worldly concerns. She is too pure for the corruption of the public sphere, too good for the brutality of business and politics. Do you see the trap? Victorian wives were placed on a pedestal, but a pedestal is just a pretty prison. You are elevated, yes, admired, certainly, but you are also stuck in place, unable to move, unable to be anything other than what others need you to be. And the specific thing Victorian wives were expected to be was their husband's spiritual nurse. We touched on this briefly earlier, but now we need to really examine what this meant in practice, because it is central to understanding why Victorian marriages became so emotionally one-sided. The phrase spiritual nurse comes from real letters, real Victorian men describing what they wanted from their wives. Remember James Paget, the young doctor we mentioned before? In 1837, he told his fiancée Lydia that he hoped to find in her his spiritual nurse, and this was not unusual. This was the ideal. A spiritual nurse tends to someone's moral and emotional wounds. She listens to his troubles without burdening him with her own. She soothes his anxieties without expressing any anxiety herself. She absorbs his negativity and reflects back only calm, only peace, only encouragement. It is emotional labour on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, and it was completely one-directional. Let me tell you about a woman named Caroline Norton. She was a writer and social reformer who lived through the heart of the Victorian era, and she left behind extensive letters that give us a window into what this spiritual nursing actually looked like day to day. In 1856, she wrote to her friend about her marriage to George Norton, a man who epitomized Victorian emotional distance. Every evening when George returns from his work, I must be ready to receive him. Not merely present, but ready. My face must be serene regardless of what troubles I have faced during the day. My voice must be gentle. I must ask about his day and listen attentively while he describes his frustrations, his dealings with difficult colleagues, his concerns about money. I must respond with sympathy and encouragement. I must make him feel that he is returning to a sanctuary of peace after the storms of his public life. So far, this might sound reasonable. Partners should support each other, should they not? But then Caroline continues, but I must never, never trouble him with my own concerns. If the children have been difficult, if the cook has given notice, if I am worried about my mother's health, if I am simply exhausted from managing the household, I must keep it to myself. To burden him with domestic troubles would be, I have been told repeatedly, a failure of my wifely duty. The home is meant to be his refuge, not another source of stress. So I smile, and I listen, and I carry my own burdens alone. And sometimes I go to my room after he has retired to his study, and I weep from the sheer exhaustion of pretending to be untroubled when I am anything but. She weeps from the exhaustion of pretending, because that is what the spiritual nurse role required. Constant performance of serenity, constant suppression of self, constant emotional availability without any expectation of reciprocal support. Women's magazines from the Victorian era are full of advice reinforcing this one-sided arrangement. An article from 1868 in the English Woman's Domestic Magazine states, "A wife must remember that her husband faces trials in the world that she cannot imagine. Her role is to be his calm harbour. She must not expect him to provide the same emotional support to her that she provides to him. Men are not constituted for such tender ministrations. A wise wife finds her emotional sustenance in her children, her charitable work, her friendships with other women, and above all in the satisfaction of serving her husband well. Find your emotional sustenance elsewhere." That was the actual advice. Do not expect emotional reciprocity from your husband. He is not capable of it, and you are selfish for wanting it. Can you imagine being told that wanting your partner to care about your feelings is selfish? That is what Victorian wives lived with, and many of them internalized it, believed it, tried their very hardest to be that perfect spiritual nurse who needed nothing for herself. But human beings do not work that way. You cannot pour out endless emotional support without ever receiving any in return. Eventually the well runs dry. Eventually you start to crack under the strain. A letter from 1879 found in a collection at Cambridge shows this breaking point. A woman named Sophia writes to her sister, "I have tried, God knows I have tried to be what Robert needs. To be always serene, always sympathetic, always ready to listen without burdening him in return. But yesterday something in me simply broke. He came home complaining of a disagreement with his business partner, and I listened for an hour as he detailed every word of their argument. Then I mentioned quite casually that I had been feeling unwell. And do you know what he said? He said, 'That is unfortunate, dear. Perhaps you should rest.' And then he immediately returned to his own concerns, as though my health was merely an inconvenient detail quickly acknowledged and then dismissed. I realized in that moment that I could collapse at his feet and he would step over me on his way to his study. I could collapse at his feet and he would step over me. That is not just emotional distance. That is emotional absence so profound that the wife has become essentially invisible as a person with her own needs and experiences. Now, here is what makes this particularly tragic. Many Victorian husbands genuinely believed they were being good husbands according to this model. They thought that by not burdening their wives with their financial worries, by maintaining composure even when they were suffering, they were protecting their wives. They thought they were doing the right thing. And many Victorian wives genuinely tried to believe that their role as spiritual nurse was enough, was meaningful, was a proper expression of love. But belief and reality are not the same thing. You can believe that self-sacrifice is noble and still die from exhaustion. You can believe that your role has purpose and still feel desperately alone. The historian Patricia Branca, in her research on Victorian women, found something telling. She analysed the private writings of middle-class wives from the 1850s through the 1890s, and she found that the language they used to describe their marriages changed over time. In the earlier decades, women wrote about their duty, their service, their pride in being good wives. But by the 1880s and 90s, a new theme emerged: resentment, not open rebellion, not yet, but a kind of quiet, bitter recognition that the bargain was unfair, that they were giving everything and receiving almost nothing in emotional return. A diary entry from 1888, written by a woman named Lillian Ashford, captures this shift. "I have been the perfect wife for 15 years. I have managed his household, borne his children, listened to his troubles, soothed his anxieties, maintained his home as a sanctuary of peace. And what has he given me in return? Money, yes. Respectability, certainly. But never, not once in 15 years, has he asked me how I truly feel. Not, 'Are you well?' which he asks occasionally as one might ask about the weather, but 'How do you feel? What do you need? What troubles you? How can I help?' Those questions do not exist in his vocabulary. I'm beginning to suspect they do not exist in his mind. I'm not a person to him. I am a function. I am the angel in the house, and angels do not have feelings that require attention. I am not a person to him. I am a function. When you reduce someone to a role, when you interact with them only as the performer of certain services rather than as a complete human being, you create a form of loneliness that is particularly cruel because the person inflicting it often has no idea they are doing so. Victorian husbands would have been shocked to hear their wives felt this way. "But I provide for her," they would protest. "She has a comfortable home, beautiful clothes, wants for nothing." And they genuinely could not understand that material provision is not the same as emotional presence, that you can give someone everything except the one thing they actually need: to be seen and known as a full person. Now, this one-sided emotional labour had interesting effects on Victorian marriage dynamics. Because while wives were expected to absorb their husband's emotional turmoil, husbands were simultaneously praised for their stoic silence. So you had this bizarre situation where a man was encouraged to unburden himself to his wife, but only about certain things and only in certain ways. He could discuss his business frustrations or his intellectual doubts, but his deeper vulnerabilities, his fears about his adequacy as a man, his genuine emotional pain, those had to remain hidden even from his spiritual nurse. So neither partner was truly being vulnerable with the other. The wife performed serenity while seething with unacknowledged needs. The husband performed controlled disclosure while hiding his deepest self. Both were acting. Both were lonely. But only the wife was expected to be aware of the other's feelings and respond to them. The husband could remain oblivious to his wife's inner life and be praised for his masculine composure. The unfairness of this becomes even clearer when you look at what happened during times of crisis. When a Victorian husband faced genuine catastrophe, business failure, or serious illness, or the death of a loved one, his wife was expected to become his rock, his constant support, his source of strength. She would nurse him through physical illness, comfort him through grief, help him navigate financial disaster. No matter how much it cost her own well-being, she was expected to be there, tirelessly, endlessly. But when a Victorian wife faced crisis, childbirth was perhaps the most telling example. Childbirth in the Victorian era was genuinely dangerous. Infection, hemorrhage, and complications killed thousands of women every year. Women approached each pregnancy knowing it might be their last. And during labour and the recovery period, they needed support, needed comfort, needed their husbands to be present and engaged. But Victorian convention said that childbirth was women's business, too delicate and too physical for male involvement. Husbands were often not even in the house during labour. They would wait at their club or their office to be notified when the ordeal was over. And afterward, they would visit the new mother briefly, praise her for producing an heir or another daughter, and then return to their regular lives while she recovered. A letter from a Victorian doctor named William Acton, published in 1870, actually advised husbands to maintain emotional distance during their wives' pregnancies and lying-in periods. He wrote, "A husband must not allow himself to become too emotionally involved in the process of childbirth. His wife requires calm, practical support, not sentimental displays. He should ensure she has adequate medical care and then trust that nature and the female attendants will manage the rest. Ensure adequate medical care and then emotionally check out." That was the actual medical advice. Your wife is going through a potentially life-threatening experience, and you should stay detached, practical, unemotional. How many Victorian women lay in their childbed, frightened and in pain, wishing desperately that their husbands would just sit with them, hold their hand, tell them they mattered beyond their reproductive function? We will never know the exact number, but the letters suggest it was most of them. And here is where the emotional imbalance becomes truly unsustainable. Because Victorian wives were watching their husbands, they were noticing the discrepancy. They saw that they were expected to be endlessly available, endlessly sympathetic, endlessly self-sacrificing, while their husbands were expected to be what exactly? Present at meals? Financially solvent? Faithful maybe, though even that was negotiable in ways it was not for women. The bargain started to feel less like a sacred partnership and more like exploitation. And once you see exploitation, once you recognize it for what it is, it becomes very difficult to continue participating in it with the same willing spirit. Women's letters from the 1880s and 90s increasingly contain a new tone, questioning, not rebellion yet, but doubt. Is this how marriage is supposed to be? Should I not expect more? Is there something wrong with me for wanting him to actually see me? A particularly poignant letter from 1891, written by a woman named Grace Pemberton to her closest friend, reads, "You asked if I love my husband still. What a question to answer. I love the man I thought he was when we were courting. I love the man I hoped he would become. But the man he actually is? The man who comes home each evening, accepts my attentions as his due, unburdens himself of his daily frustrations, and then retreats into his own world without ever asking about mine. I do not know if what I feel for that man is love or just resigned habit. I have been his spiritual nurse for 12 years. But who nurses me? Who tends to my spirit? I am so tired, dear friend, so unutterably tired. Who nurses me? That question echoes through Victorian women's writings, and increasingly they were finding answers outside their marriages. Female friendships became intensely important, places where women could actually be vulnerable, could actually share their struggles and receive genuine sympathy in return. Women found emotional sustenance in their relationships with their children, their sisters, their female friends. They created whole networks of mutual support that their husbands were not part of and often did not even know existed. In a way, Victorian wives created their own separate emotional sphere, a mirror to the separate physical spheres of Victorian society. Men had the public world, women had the private world. And within that private world, women built intimate connections with each other that their marriages fundamentally lacked. Which raises an interesting question. If Victorian wives found emotional fulfillment primarily with other women and with their children, what exactly was their husband's role in their emotional lives? Provider, yes. Authority figure, certainly. But intimate companion, partner who truly knew them. That role was increasingly being filled by people who were not their husbands at all. This is how marriages hollow out. Not through dramatic betrayals or spectacular failures, but through the slow realization that the person you are legally bound to for life is essentially a stranger, and will remain a stranger no matter how many years you share a home. The Victorian marriage was breaking apart at the seams, and as wives began to recognize the unfairness of the emotional bargain they'd been sold, they also began to wonder what would happen if they stopped holding up their end. What if they stopped being spiritual nurses? What if they demanded reciprocity, demanded to be seen as full people with needs of their own? Those questions would have consequences that Victorian society was not prepared to handle. Because once you start questioning the fundamental structure of marriage, once you start asking that the emperor might actually be wearing no clothes, you cannot easily go back to unquestioning acceptance. The 19th century was about to give way to the 20th, and with it would come challenges to Victorian marriage that would shake the entire institution. Imagine you are watching a play where the lead actor must perform two completely different characters in the same evening. At 7 o'clock, he is a ruthless businessman making calculated decisions without sentiment. At 8 o'clock, he walks onto a different stage and must become a gentle husband radiating warmth and affection. No costume change between acts, no time to shift his mindset, just an instant transformation that the audience expects to be seamless and convincing. This was the daily reality for Victorian men, and most of them failed spectacularly at it, though not for lack of trying. The problem was simple to describe but impossible to solve. The skills that made you successful in the public sphere were exactly the skills that destroyed intimacy in the private sphere. Assertiveness became domination. Strategic thinking became emotional manipulation. Competitive drive became an inability to collaborate. Self-sufficiency became isolation. The Victorian man was trained to be one thing in the world and expected to magically become something entirely different when he crossed his own threshold. It did not work. It could not work. And the evidence of this failure is written in thousands of Victorian marriages that slowly calcified into polite cohabitation between incompatible strangers. Let me introduce you to a man named Richard Thornton. He kept detailed journals from 1865 until his death in 1907, and these journals were donated to the British Library by his great-granddaughter in 1996. They provide a rare window into the internal struggle of a Victorian man trying to navigate these two incompatible worlds. In 1873, Richard was 38 years old, a partner in a Liverpool shipping firm, married to a woman named Anne for 12 years. In his journal, he writes about a typical day. Rose at 5:30, reviewed contracts until breakfast, at the office by 8, spent morning in difficult negotiations with Mr. Henderson regarding the shipping rates to India. He attempted to undercut our position. I remained firm, showed no hesitation, made clear we would not be moved. Secured favourable terms by refusing to show any flexibility. Luncheon at the club with Collins and Stewart. Discussed the political situation. Maintained strong opinions, allowed no room for doubt. Returned to office. More contracts, more negotiations, more assertion of will. Then he writes, home by 7. Anne greeted me at the door, asked about my day. found myself speaking to her in the same tone I had used all day, assertive, brooking no discussion. She mentioned wanting to visit her sister in Manchester. I told her it was not convenient. She began to explain why it mattered to her. I cut her off, said the matter was decided, saw something close in her face like shutters being drawn. Realised only after I had retired to my study that I had spoken to my wife as though she were a difficult business partner to be managed rather than what? I no longer know how one is supposed to speak to a wife. I only know how to speak as a man of business, and increasingly that is the only man I know how to be. That last line haunts me. That is the only man I know how to be. Because the public persona had taken over completely, there was no separation anymore between the businessman and the husband. There was only the businessman, bringing his professional persona home and wondering why it created such coldness in his own house. This was not unusual. This was the norm. The Victorian workplace demanded a particular type of masculinity: aggressive, dominant, emotionally controlled, competitive, always projecting confidence even when you felt none. And if you spent 12 to 14 hours a day performing that masculinity, it became who you were. You could not just switch it off when you walk through your front door. The historian Martin Francis, in his research on Victorian masculinity, found what he called personality bleed. The characteristics men cultivated for success in business inevitably bled into their home lives. Decisive became dictatorial, confident became dismissive, strategic became manipulative, self-contained became emotionally unavailable, and Victorian wives noticed. Oh, how they noticed. A letter from 1877, written by a woman named Constance Fitzroy to her cousin, describes this phenomenon with painful clarity. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if James would speak to his business associates the way he speaks to me. Certainly not. He would be charming, persuasive, attentive to their concerns. But to me, he issues pronouncements. He makes decisions without consultation. He listens to my opinions the way one might listen to a child's chatter, with benevolent disinterest. I am not his partner. I am something he manages, like a moderately important business concern that requires occasional attention but certainly not genuine collaboration. Not a partner, something to be managed. Because that is what the public sphere taught Victorian men to do: manage, control, dominate. And they brought those skills home and applied them to the people who needed something entirely different. But here is where it gets complicated. Some Victorian men were aware of this problem. They knew they were being too harsh, too controlling, too emotionally distant at home. They wanted to be different, but they had no idea how. There is a remarkable letter from 1884 preserved in a private collection, written by a man named Graham Westfield to his younger brother, who was about to marry. Graham had been married for 15 years and he was trying to offer advice. "Dear Robert, you asked me what makes a marriage work. I confess I do not know. I know what makes a business work: clear hierarchy, firm decisions, strategic thinking, emotional control. But marriage seems to require the opposite of everything that makes me successful in the world. Mary wants me to be vulnerable, to share my feelings, to ask her opinion and genuinely value it rather than simply making decisions and expecting compliance. She wants collaboration where I only know command. She wants emotional expression where I only know restraint. I love her, Robert, but I do not know how to love her in the way she needs. 15 years of trying and I still have not learnt the language she speaks. I give her my best self, the competent, successful, controlled man who has built a prosperous life, and she weeps because that is not what she wants at all. She weeps because that is not what she wants at all. The tragedy in that sentence is profound. A man offering what he believes is his best self and discovering it is precisely what his wife does not need. Now, you might be thinking, why could these men not learn? Why could they not develop different personas for different contexts the way we all do to some extent? And the answer is that emotional flexibility itself was considered unmasculine. A man who could shift between different emotional registers, who could be one way at work and another way at home, would have been seen as lacking integrity, as being somehow false. Victorian masculinity prized consistency. A real man was the same in all contexts, controlled, rational, authoritative. Being different at home than you were in public suggested you were performing, pretending, being inauthentic. So men felt pressure to be the same person everywhere, and the person they chose to be was the one that brought them success, respect, and social advancement. The public man, the private man, the vulnerable man, the emotionally available man. He had nowhere to exist. He was not rewarded in the workplace, not modelled by other men, not validated by society, so he withered from disuse or never developed at all. A memoir published in 1928 by a woman named Edith Olivier, looking back on her parents' Victorian marriage, contains this observation. My father was two different people depending on whether he had company. When guests visited, particularly male guests, he would transform. He would become animated, jovial even. He would tell stories, make jokes, engage in lively political debates. I remember being astonished the first time I saw this version of my father. I had only ever known the silent, stern man who presided over our family dinners like a judge overseeing a court. Mother saw it too. After the guests left, she said quietly, "I wish I could marry that man, the one who laughs." And father overheard her. His face closed like the door shutting. He said, "That is not appropriate behaviour for family life, Edith. One must maintain standards." As though warmth and humour were incompatible with proper fatherhood and husbandry. As though warmth and humour were incompatible with proper family life. This belief that you had to be stern and distant to be respected by your family was widespread. Men genuinely thought that if they showed too much affection, too much playfulness, too much humanity, their wives and children would lose respect for them. So they maintained the facade. They brought their public face home, and they wondered why their families seemed to shrink away from them, why intimacy felt impossible, why everyone seemed happiest when he was away. The separate spheres doctrine created this problem, but it also prevented the solution. Because if the public sphere was inherently corrupting and the private sphere was meant to be pure, then the man who inhabited the public sphere was by definition contaminated. He could not bring his public self into the private sphere without polluting it. But he also could not leave his public self behind, because that public self was his identity, his worth, his very definition of masculinity. Catch 22. Damned if you do, damned if you do not. Some men tried to create a third space, a middle ground where they could be slightly more relaxed than at home, but slightly more genuine than at work. These were the gentlemen's clubs that proliferated in Victorian London. White's, Brooks, the Reform Club, the Athenaeum. These were spaces where men could gather with other men and, what exactly? Not be vulnerable, certainly. Not express genuine emotion, but perhaps be slightly less guarded, slightly more able to hint at difficulties without fully acknowledging them. The clubs became a sort of emotional pressure valve, a place where men could be in each other's company without the performance requirements of either business or home. But even there, the rules were strict. You did not discuss your marriage troubles. You did not admit to financial difficulties. You did not show weakness. You just sat in leather chairs, read newspapers, discussed politics in abstract terms, and pretended that this counted as companionship. A rather dark joke circulated in the 1880s. Where does a Victorian gentleman go to be himself? Nowhere. There is no such place. The joke was funny because it was true. There was literally no space in Victorian society where men were permitted to drop the masculine facade and simply be human. And this affected not just marriages but friendships too. Victorian men had no model for genuine male friendship that included emotional intimacy. They could be colleagues, club members, fellow sportsmen. But friends in the sense of people who actually knew each other's inner lives, that was exceedingly rare. The letters between Victorian men are fascinating to read because of what is not there. They discuss business, politics, sports, intellectual topics. They make plans to meet. They comment on each other's successes, but they almost never say "I'm struggling" or "I'm afraid" or "I need help." The emotional content is absent, replaced by a kind of cheerful stoicism that reveals nothing, except in one context. When Victorian men wrote to each other from the front lines of war, suddenly the letters changed. Suddenly you see genuine vulnerability, genuine fear, genuine need for emotional connection. It was as though the proximity of death gave them permission to drop the facade and be real with each other. But in peacetime, in the ordinary course of life, the facade remained firmly in place with men and with wives. The Victorian man lived inside a suit of armour he could never take off, and that armour protected him from vulnerability but also prevented intimacy. You cannot embrace someone while wearing a full suit of armour. You cannot be truly known by someone who only ever sees your metal exterior. Now here is where this connects to our larger story about marriage. The Victorian wife was told that her husband's distance was normal, even noble, that his emotional unavailability was a sign of his strength and protection of her, that she should not expect him to be different because men simply were not capable of emotional intimacy the way women were. And many wives believed this for a long time. They accepted that their husbands were fundamentally different creatures, that emotional distance was just part of being male, that longing for something more was unrealistic. But then something happened. They saw glimpses, moments when their husbands let the guard down, usually by accident. A moment of genuine laughter, a flash of vulnerability quickly hidden, a comment that revealed actual feeling beneath the controlled exterior. And those glimpses proved that their husbands were capable of more. They chose not to give it. Or more accurately, they felt unable to give it because the cost to their masculine identity would be too high. A journal entry from 1891 written by a woman named Margaret Sinclair captures this realization. Today I saw Edward crying. He did not know I saw. He was in his study, door slightly ajar, and I happened to pass by. He was holding a letter, and tears were streaming down his face. Silent tears, the kind you cry when you have had a lifetime of practice keeping quiet. I do not know what the letter contained. Perhaps news of a friend's death, perhaps a financial disaster, perhaps nothing more than accumulated sorrow finding release. But in that moment I understood. He feels everything. Everything I feel, he feels too. He simply never ever shows it. All these years I thought he was incapable of deep emotion, but he is not incapable. He is imprisoned, and I do not know which is worse. He is not incapable. He is imprisoned. That distinction matters enormously, because if your husband is incapable of emotional connection, there is nothing to be done. You accept it and find your emotional life elsewhere. But if he is capable but choosing not to connect, or feeling unable to connect because of social pressure, that is different. That suggests the possibility of change. That suggests you are being denied something that could exist if only the prison bars would come down. And increasingly, Victorian wives were recognizing the bars. They were seeing that their husband's emotional distance was not natural or inevitable, but constructed, maintained, enforced by a system that benefited no one. But recognizing a problem and solving it are very different things. Because how do you convince a man to become vulnerable when his entire sense of self-worth is tied to being invulnerable? How do you create intimacy with someone who's been trained since childhood to equate intimacy with weakness? How do you build a partnership with someone who only knows how to be in charge? These were the questions Victorian wives increasingly asked themselves, and the answers, when they came, would challenge the very foundation of Victorian marriage. But before we get to those challenges and their consequences, we need to understand one more piece of this puzzle. We need to talk about the bedroom. Because if Victorian emotional distance created problems in the day-to-day life of marriage, it created absolute havoc in the most intimate aspect of marriage. And that havoc has consequences that echo through generations. The most private room in the Victorian house held the most public anxieties. The bedroom, that space where husband and wife were supposed to achieve the ultimate union, the sacred consummation of their vows, became instead another theatre for performance, another site of senos, another place where intimacy went to die behind heavy curtains and locked doors. We need to talk about Victorian sexuality, not because it is salacious or shocking, though some of it certainly is both, but because you cannot understand Victorian emotional distance without understanding how completely tangled up it was with sexual shame, confusion and repression so profound that it damaged not just individual marriages, but the entire cultural understanding of what physical intimacy could mean. Let me start with a peculiar Victorian phrase that you may have heard. Lie back and think of England. This was supposedly advice given to Victorian brides on their wedding nights, though the exact origin is disputed. But whether or not anyone actually said those words, they perfectly capture the Victorian attitude toward female sexuality. Sex was not something a proper woman enjoyed. It was something she endured for the sake of duty, reproduction, and keeping her husband from seeking satisfaction elsewhere. But here is what makes this interesting. While women were told to be passive and uninterested, men were simultaneously told that sexual desire itself was dangerous and degrading. That lust, even within marriage, was a kind of animal passion that threatened to overwhelm reason and spirituality. The ideal Victorian marriage was supposed to be based on pure love, spiritual connection, meeting of souls, and sex. Sex was the unfortunate physical necessity that came with marriage but should be kept as minimal and as controlled as possible. Can you imagine trying to build intimacy under those conditions, where the most physically intimate thing two people can do is supposed to be done without pleasure, without communication, without any acknowledgement that it is happening at all? A medical text from 1867, written by Dr. William Acton, one of the most influential voices on sexuality in the Victorian era, contains this remarkable passage. The majority of women, happily for society, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. What men are habitually, women are only exceptionally. It is too true, I admit, as the divorce courts show, that there are some few women who have sexual desires so strong that they surpass those of men. I admit that it is no slight burden on a husband to have to satisfy the sexual demands of a wife with a propensity for passion, but I am convinced that in the majority of cases, the married woman submits to her husband's embraces with indifference or with positive distaste, and any contrary belief is likely to have been formed from the exceptional cases that come before divorce courts. Read that again. Women who enjoy sex are exceptional, possibly pathological, and a burden to their husbands. The normal woman feels indifference or distaste. This was not fringe thinking. This was mainstream Victorian medical opinion, taught to doctors, shared with worried husbands, internalized by countless women who wondered if something was wrong with them for having desires they had been told they should not have. And for men, they faced their own impossible contradiction. On one hand, male sexual desire was acknowledged as natural, even inevitable. Men needed sexual release, the Victorians believed, or they would become ill. There was genuine medical concern about male celibacy leading to various health problems. On the other hand, that same sexual desire was seen as base, animal, the lowest part of human nature that must be controlled and minimized. So Victorian men were supposed to have sexual needs but be ashamed of them, to desire their wives but not too much, not too obviously, not in ways that revealed actual passion. The ideal was controlled, infrequent, perfunctory sexual relations that produced children but did not disturb the spiritual purity of marriage. How do you achieve that? How do you be sexual but not passionate, desirous but not lustful, physically intimate but emotionally distant? The answer, for most Victorian couples, was to not talk about it at all, to conduct their sexual lives in complete sense, both literal and figurative. A letter from 1875, found in a collection of women's correspondence at the London School of Economics, was written by a young bride named Charlotte to an older married cousin. She wrote 3 months after her wedding. "Dear Cousin Jane, I write to you because I have no one else to ask about these matters which are too indelicate for proper discussion. My husband comes to my room perhaps twice a week, always after I have retired and put out the lamp. He says nothing. I say nothing. The act is completed in darkness and silence, and then he returns to his own chamber. I do not know if this is how it should be. I do not know if I should feel something. I feel only confusion and a vague sense that we are doing something vaguely shameful that we must pretend is not happening. The next morning we discuss the weather over breakfast as though the night never occurred. Is this marriage? Is this intimacy? I feel more alone now than when I was unmarried." Completed in darkness and silence. This was not unusual. This was standard practice for many Victorian couples. Sex happened in the dark without discussion, without acknowledgement. Husband and wife never spoke about it, never discussed their needs or desires or concerns. Many women had no idea what to expect on their wedding night, having been told only the vaguest euphemisms about their wifely duties. Many men, despite perhaps having some experience with prostitutes, had no idea how to actually make love to a wife who was supposed to be pure and untouchable. The result was often decades of deeply unsatisfying sexual relations that neither partner had the vocabulary or permission to improve, because talking about sex was unthinkable. Even between husband and wife, even in the privacy of their bedroom, sex was the great unmentionable. Now this sexual sneers and repression fed directly into emotional distance. Because physical intimacy and emotional intimacy are deeply connected, are they not? When you can be physically vulnerable with someone, when you can communicate about desire and pleasure and needs, when you can be playful or passionate or simply present with each other in that space, it builds emotional closeness. It creates a kind of knowing that exists nowhere else. But Victorian couples were denied all of that. Their physical intimacy, such as it was, happened in silence and shame. There was no communication, no vulnerability, no presence, just a biological function performed in darkness and never mentioned in daylight. And because they could not talk about sex, they also could not talk about the emotional impact of their sexual relationship. The wife who felt used, treated as a receptacle rather than a person, she could not say so. The husband who sensed his wife's reluctance and felt rejected, inadequate, monstrous for having desires, he could not say so. The couple whose sexual incompatibility was creating a chasm between them, they had no language to address it, so the distance grew, night after night of physical contact without emotional connection. The most intimate act two people can share, stripped of intimacy and turned into something awkward, shameful, and isolating. The historian Peter Gay, who spent decades researching Victorian sexuality, found something fascinating in his analysis of Victorian diaries and letters. He discovered that many Victorian couples were having sex more frequently than the stereotypes suggest, and that some women clearly enjoyed it despite being told they should not. But the inability to communicate about it, the absolute prohibition on discussing sexual matters openly, meant that even couples who might have had satisfying physical relationships could not acknowledge or build on that satisfaction. He found one diary entry from a Victorian wife who wrote in code about her sexual encounters with her husband, using symbols that scholars took years to decode. When finally translated, the entries revealed a woman who clearly enjoyed physical intimacy with her husband and seemed to believe he enjoyed it too. But she had to write about it in secret code, even in her private diary. Even alone with her own thoughts, she could not openly acknowledge sexual pleasure without shame. Imagine living like that. Imagine having a potentially positive aspect of your marriage, but feeling unable to acknowledge it, build on it, or even admit to yourself that it exists without layers of shame and secrecy. And for couples who were not sexually compatible, who found the physical aspect of marriage awkward or painful or simply unsatisfying, they had no recourse, no way to seek advice without revealing information that was socially unacceptable to share, no way to work together to improve things, because working together would require discussion, and discussion was forbidden. The sexual manuals of the era are almost comically unhelpful. Most of them focus on reproduction, not pleasure. They provide clinical descriptions of anatomy and conception, but virtually nothing about actual intimacy. Some actively discourage too much physical contact, warning that excessive sexual activity could lead to various illnesses, moral degradation, or exhaustion of vital energies. An advice book from 1882 warns husbands, conjugal relations should be approached with solemnity and restraint. The husband who seeks his wife's bed too frequently risks depleting his vital forces and reducing her to a state of nervous exhaustion. Once or twice monthly is generally sufficient for maintaining health and producing offspring. More frequent congress suggests a lack of self-control that is unbecoming to a gentleman. Once or twice monthly. Saw twice. That was the actual advice, and notice the language. Seeks his wife's bed, as though he is a supplicant approaching something sacred and dangerous, maintaining health and producing offspring, as though those are the only two acceptable reasons for sex. Nothing about pleasure, about connection, about desire, about any of the things that make physical intimacy actually intimate. Now, the impact of this sexual repression on Victorian marriage cannot be overstated, because when physical intimacy becomes a source of shame and anxiety, rather than connection and pleasure, it poisons the entire relationship. The bedroom becomes a place of tension rather than relaxation. The most vulnerable moments become performances of duty rather than expressions of genuine feeling. And here is where it connects back to emotional distance. Victorian men, already trained to suppress emotion, already keeping their wives at arm's length through all the mechanisms we have discussed, now had to navigate physical intimacy while maintaining that same emotional distance. They had to be sexual without being passionate, to desire without showing desire, to seek physical satisfaction while pretending they were merely fulfilling a biological function. The contradictions were maddening. Be a man, which means having sexual needs, but do not be too sexual, which means not needing too much. Desire your wife, but not in ways that reveal you see her as a sexual being, because that would sully her purity. Be physically intimate, but maintain emotional distance. Make love without love, or at least without showing it. One Victorian husband, in a letter to his doctor seeking advice for what he called his marital difficulties, wrote in 1889, "I find myself unable to approach my wife without feeling I'm committing some sort of violation, even though she is legally mine to approach. She lies there, passive and silent, and I feel like a brute. But if I abstain for too long, I become irritable and unwell. The doctors say a man needs regular release, but how does one achieve release with a person who seems to be enduring rather than participating? And how does one discuss this when the very subject is unspeakable? How does one discuss this when the very subject is unspeakable? That is the core problem. Victorian sexual repression was not just about not having sex, or not enjoying sex. It was about the complete prohibition on communication about sex. And without communication, there can be no improvement, no mutual understanding, no working together to create something meaningful. The silence around sexuality created its own form of loneliness. Husband and wife sharing a bed, but not sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their needs, their fears. Both carrying private anxieties, private confusions, private disappointments that could never be voiced. The bedroom should be the most intimate space in a marriage, but for many Victorian couples, it was just another place where they performed roles rather than being themselves. And here is the tragic irony. The Victorians created this sexual repression in the name of spiritual purity, in the name of elevating marriage above mere physical passion. They wanted marriage to be about souls meeting, not bodies. But by suppressing the physical, by making sex shameful and unspeakable, they actually prevented the very spiritual intimacy they claimed to value. Because you cannot have genuine soul-level connection with someone while maintaining shame and secrecy about the most vulnerable aspects of your relationship. The Victorian bedroom, like every other aspect of Victorian marriage, was built on contradictions that could not be resolved. Be physically intimate but emotionally distant. Desire without passion. Connect without communicating. And somehow through all of this, build a marriage that provided emotional fulfillment and spiritual satisfaction. It was impossible. And the evidence of that impossibility is written in the rising divorce rates, the increase in documented marital misery, and the growing voices of women and even some men who began to say this system is not working. This is not what marriage should be. Something has to change. Those voices, tentative at first but growing louder as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, would challenge everything the Victorians believed about marriage, about gender, about intimacy itself. The cracks in the Victorian marriage facade were becoming impossible to ignore, and through those cracks people began to glimpse the possibility of something different, something better. But change never comes easily, and the fight to transform Victorian marriage would have casualties, scandals, and consequences that nobody fully anticipated. On August 28, 1857, something revolutionary happened in England that would change marriage forever. Parliament passed the Matrimonial Causes Act, transferring divorce from the jurisdiction of the Church to civil courts. Before this date, getting a divorce in England required a literal act of Parliament. Each divorce had to be individually approved by lawmakers, making it so expensive and socially devastating that only about 4 divorces occurred per year in the entire country. After 1857, divorce became theoretically accessible to ordinary people. Theoretically being the key word, because what followed was not an avalanche of liberation, but rather a very public exposure of just how broken Victorian marriage had become. The courtrooms became theatres where private misery was displayed for public consumption, and the newspaper coverage of these divorce cases revealed truths that polite society had been desperately trying to keep hidden. The floodgates did not exactly burst open. In 1858, the first year under the new law, there were 300 divorce petitions filed. By 1880, that number had climbed to about 500 per year. These are tiny numbers compared to the population, but they represented something significant. Public acknowledgement that Victorian marriage was failing and failing often. And when you read the actual divorce cases, when you see what was documented in those courtroom proceedings, you find emotional distance appearing again and again as a central complaint, though often hidden under other accusations because emotional distance itself was not grounds for divorce. A woman could not file for divorce simply because her husband never spoke to her, never showed affection, never acknowledged her as a person. That was not legally actionable, but she could file if he committed adultery, and she could also file if he was guilty of cruelty. And here is where it gets interesting. Victorian women began defining emotional cruelty in ways that challenged the very foundation of acceptable husbandly behaviour. Let me tell you about a case from 1864 that made headlines across England. A woman named Frances Codrington filed for divorce from her husband, Admiral Sir Edward Codrington. The case became famous not because of any spectacular adultery or physical violence, but because Frances dared to argue that her husband's systematic emotional neglect constituted cruelty. Her testimony, preserved in court records, described a marriage of 23 years in which her husband maintained absolute emotional distance. He spoke to her only when necessary, showed no interest in her thoughts or feelings, made all decisions without consultation, and treated her presence in his life as an administrative detail to be managed rather than a partnership to be nurtured. When she tried to discuss her unhappiness, he told her she was being hysterical and suggested she occupy herself with appropriate womanly pursuits. The court ultimately ruled against her. The judge stated that while the Admiral's behaviour was not conducive to marital happiness, it did not constitute legal cruelty. A husband had no obligation to show affection, engage in conversation, or consider his wife's emotional needs. As long as he provided financial support and did not physically harm her, he was fulfilling his legal duties as a husband. Frances Codrington lost her case, her reputation, and her access to her children. But her testimony was published in newspapers, and thousands of Victorian women read it and saw their own marriages reflected back at them. She had said out loud what so many felt in silence, that a marriage without emotional connection, without genuine partnership, without being truly seen and known by your spouse, was a form of suffering that deserved recognition. The public response was fascinating. Some condemned Frances as an ungrateful woman who did not appreciate a respectable husband who provided well, but others, particularly women, wrote letters to newspapers arguing that she had exposed a fundamental truth. Victorian marriage, as it was currently constructed, was often a form of legal and social entrapment that left women utterly isolated. One letter to the Times in October 1864, signed only a sufferer, read, "Mrs. Codrington has given voice to what thousands of us feel but dare not say. We are married to men who treat us as furniture, as decorative objects that occasionally require maintenance. We are alone in the most intimate relationship a person can have, and we are told this is normal, this is proper, this is what we should have expected. How many more generations of women must endure this particular form of respectable misery before society acknowledges that a marriage without genuine companionship is a marriage in name only?" The divorce courts revealed something else too, that emotional distance often went hand in hand with other forms of marital breakdown. When women did manage to successfully divorce on grounds of adultery or physical cruelty, their testimonies frequently included descriptions of years of emotional neglect that preceded the actionable offence. It was as though emotional distance created a kind of marital wasteland where other betrayals could take root. A husband who had never truly connected with his wife found it easier to seek connection elsewhere. A wife who felt invisible in her own home became vulnerable to anyone who actually saw her. The distance that Victorian culture insisted was normal and proper became the crack through which marriages ultimately shattered. The statistics from the late Victorian period tell a story of slowly increasing marital breakdown. By the 1890s, divorce rates had roughly doubled from the early years of the new law. But divorce numbers alone do not capture the full picture, because many couples who were deeply unhappy stayed married. Divorce was still scandalous, still expensive, still socially devastating, particularly for women who would lose custody of their children and often their social position entirely. So instead of divorce, you had legal separations, you had couples living separate lives under the same roof, you had arrangements where husband and wife barely saw each other, maintaining the facade of marriage while essentially being strangers. These situations do not show up in divorce statistics, but they were arguably more common than actual divorces. A social survey conducted in 1896 by a reformer named Clementina Black interviewed 200 married women from various social classes about their marital satisfaction. The results, published in a small journal that few people read at the time, are startling. Only about 30% of the women described their marriages as satisfying. Another 40% described them as tolerable but lonely. The remaining 30% used words like imprisonment, isolation, and slow death. Slow death. That is what one woman called her marriage, not because her husband beat her or cheated on her, but because he had not really spoken to her in any meaningful way in 15 years. And men, they rarely spoke publicly about their marital unhappiness because doing so would have been unmanly. But private letters and diaries suggest that many Victorian men were just as miserable as their wives, if in different ways. They felt the distance too, felt the loneliness of living with someone you could not truly know, but they had even less vocabulary than women did for expressing that pain, even less permission to admit it existed. A letter from 1892 found in a collection donated to Oxford was written by a man named Philip Hartley to his brother in Australia. Philip had been married for 18 years and was writing because his brother, considering marriage, had asked for advice. "You ask if I am happy in my marriage. What a question to answer honestly. Martha is a good woman. She runs the household efficiently, raises the children properly, causes me no trouble. But am I happy? I suppose I am not unhappy, which is perhaps the most I can hope for. We live parallel lives, she in her sphere and I in mine. Sometimes we meet for dinner and discuss the weather or the children's schooling, but I could not tell you what she thinks about, what she dreams of, what makes her laugh when I am not there, and she knows nothing of me beyond what I present at meals. I provide for her materially, and she provides for me domestically, and we call this marriage. Is it enough? I do not know. I know only that I am 43 years old and I have spent 18 years living with someone I do not really know and who does not really know me, and I will spend the rest of my life the same way, because what else is there to do? What else is there to do? That resignation, that acceptance of loneliness as the price of respectability, runs through so many Victorian writings about marriage. People stayed in empty marriages not because they lacked imagination for something better, but because the alternative was social death, financial ruin, separation from children, complete loss of respectability. But the divorce cases and the conversations they sparked began to change something in the culture. People started questioning whether this was truly the best humans could do, whether marriage had to be this way, whether emotional distance was really an inevitable, acceptable feature of male-female relationships, or whether it was something that could be challenged and changed. Women's magazines in the 1880s and 90s began cautiously suggesting that perhaps wives deserved more than just financial provision, that perhaps emotional companionship should be an expected part of marriage rather than a bonus if you were lucky. These were radical ideas, and they were usually couched in very careful language to avoid seeming too demanding or unfeminine. But the ideas were out there, circulating, taking root. And novels, Victorian novels from the later period, increasingly portrayed unhappy marriages and questioned traditional gender roles. George Eliot's Middlemarch, published in 1871 and 72, features multiple marriages that fail precisely because of emotional incompatibility and the inability of husbands and wives to truly communicate. Thomas Hardy's novels from the 1880s and 90s are full of marriages destroyed by the rigid expectations of Victorian society. These were not just entertainment, they were diagnosis and critique. Victorian readers saw their own lives reflected in these fictional marriages, and they began to wonder if perhaps the problem was not with individual couples, but with the entire system. The concept of incompatibility emerged as a way to describe marital failure that did not require anyone to be the villain. Earlier in the Victorian era, if a marriage failed, someone had to be at fault, someone had to be blamed. The husband was a brute or the wife was a shrew. But by the late Victorian period, people started recognizing that sometimes two perfectly decent people were simply incompatible, and forcing them to stay together for decades was cruel to both. This was a huge conceptual shift. It suggested that marriage was about something more than duty and provision, that it required some kind of fundamental matching that went beyond social class and financial stability. It suggested, though nobody quite said it directly yet, that emotional connection mattered, that being truly known by your partner mattered, that intimacy was not a luxury but a necessity. The newspapers loved divorce cases because they sold papers. The public was fascinated by these glimpses into private lives, these revelations of what happened behind closed doors in respectable homes. And with each case, with each testimony of neglect or cruelty or simple inability to connect, the Victorian facade of marital bliss cracked a little more. But here is what is really interesting. While divorce rates were rising, while public acknowledgement of marital problems was increasing, the advice literature was desperately trying to shore up the old model. The marriage manuals from the 1890s are almost panicked in tone, insisting more stridently than ever that wives should submit, that husbands should maintain authority, that emotional distance was proper and natural. It is like watching someone try to hold back the tide. The culture was shifting underneath the official pronouncements. Real people in real marriages were increasingly unwilling to accept loneliness as the price of respectability. They wanted more, they deserved more. And slowly, painfully, the Victorian model of marriage was being exposed as inadequate. The psychological cost of all this was enormous. And that is what we need to talk about next. Because Victorian emotional distance did not just create unhappy marriages, it created a mental health crisis that Victorian society was completely unprepared to handle. The same stoic, emotionally repressed men who were supposed to be the pillars of society were breaking down in alarming numbers. And when they broke, the carefully maintained fiction that emotional suppression was healthy and noble became impossible to sustain. The Manor House Asylum in Chiswick kept meticulous records of its patients from 1855 onward, and when medical historians finally gained access to these records in the late 20th century, they discovered something that challenged everything Victorian society claimed about masculine strength. Between 1870 and 1900, the asylum admitted over 3,000 male patients diagnosed with what was then called neurosthenia, or nervous exhaustion. These were not poor men or criminals, or the socially marginal. These were businessmen, professionals, respected members of the middle and upper classes, men who had supposedly mastered the art of stoic masculinity, men who were breaking down anyway. The case files make for heartbreaking reading. Patient after patient described the same symptoms: paralyzing anxiety, inability to concentrate, physical collapse, episodes of uncontrollable weeping, loss of will, what the Victorians called a complete nervous breakdown. And when doctors interviewed these men about what had led to their collapse, a pattern emerged that should have surprised no one but somehow shocked everyone. These men had been trying to be invulnerable, and the effort had destroyed them. Let me tell you about a specific case because the details matter. In 1883, a man named Lawrence Hawthorne was admitted to Manor House. He was 41 years old, a solicitor with a successful practice in London, married with 5 children. His admission notes, written by Dr. James Crichton Browne, one of the leading mental health physicians of the era, describe him as a man who appears to have maintained perfect composure in all circumstances until quite suddenly losing all capacity for self-control. Dr. Crichton Browne's detailed case history reveals what perfect composure actually meant. Lawrence had not cried since he was 12 years old when he was beaten at school for showing emotion. He worked 12-hour days and never complained of fatigue. When his oldest daughter died of scarlet fever 2 years earlier, he attended her funeral with dry eyes and returned to work the next day. When his business partner embezzled funds and nearly bankrupted the firm, he maintained absolute calm while working to restore financial stability. When his wife suffered a miscarriage, he patted her hand and told her to be brave, then spent the evening reviewing contracts. And then one Tuesday morning in April, Lawrence walked into his office, sat down at his desk and could not move. He sat there for 6 hours, frozen, unable to speak or write or perform any function. His clerks finally called for a doctor, who found Lawrence weeping uncontrollably and saying over and over, "I cannot do this anymore. I cannot be this anymore." What broke in Lawrence was not his strength, but the facade of strength he had maintained for nearly 30 years. Everything he had been told was good and noble about masculinity, all the suppression and control and emotional lockdown, had reached a breaking point, and when it broke catastrophically. The diagnosis of neurosthenia was essentially Victorian medicine's way of acknowledging that people could not actually function while suppressing all emotion and vulnerability. But here is the fascinating and frustrating part. Victorian doctors recognized the problem but completely misunderstood the solution. They saw men breaking down from emotional repression and concluded that these men needed more rest, more isolation, more removal from stress. What they did not understand was that the isolation itself was part of the problem. The treatment at places like Manor House typically involved what they called the rest cure. Patients were confined to bed, forbidden from working or even reading or writing. They were supposed to simply rest, rebuild their nervous energy through complete inactivity. For some patients, particularly those suffering from physical exhaustion, this probably helped. But for men whose real problem was emotional isolation and the inability to be vulnerable with anyone, forced rest in isolation just made things worse. What these men actually needed was connection, was permission to be human, was someone to tell them that it was acceptable to feel things, to struggle, to need support. But Victorian medicine could not prescribe that, because Victorian society itself was built on denying those very things. Now here is where it connects to our story about marriage and emotional distance. Many of the men admitted to asylums for nervous breakdown were described in their case files as having distant relationships with their wives. The doctors noted it almost in passing, as though it was just one more detail among many. Patient reports cordial but formal relations with his wife of 15 years. Patient states his wife does not understand his work-related pressures. Patient maintains separate sleeping quarters and minimal conversation with spouse. The doctors did not connect these observations to the mental breakdown. They saw the distant marriage as normal, unremarkable. They did not understand that a man going through profound psychological crisis without any emotional support from his life partner was experiencing a particularly cruel form of isolation. Do you see the tragedy here? These men were married. They lived with someone. They were not physically alone, but they were utterly isolated in their suffering, because the one person who should have been their intimate companion was a stranger kept at arm's length by decades of emotional distance. A letter written by a wife whose husband had been admitted to an asylum in 1889 provides a heartbreaking glimpse into this dynamic. The letter was to her sister, and it was found in a collection donated to the Women's Library in London. They tell me Frederick is suffering from nervous exhaustion and must rest for several months. I do not know what to do with this information. I want to help him, want to comfort him, but we have been married 13 years and I do not know how to comfort him. We have never been in the habit of comforting each other. He has never told me when he struggled, never admitted weakness, never sought my support, and I, following his lead and society's dictates, have never offered what was not requested. Now he is broken, and I am his wife, and I realize I do not know him well enough to know what he needs. What kind of marriage have we had that in his moment of greatest need I am as useless to him as a stranger would be? What kind of marriage indeed? A marriage that followed all the Victorian rules, maintained all the appropriate distance, kept all emotions carefully controlled. And when the crisis came, that marriage had no foundation strong enough to bear weight. The neurosthenia epidemic, as it came to be called, challenged Victorian ideals of masculinity in ways that made people deeply uncomfortable. If strong, stoic, emotionally controlled men were breaking down in epidemic numbers, what did that say about whether those qualities were actually healthy? What did it suggest about whether the Victorian model of masculinity was sustainable? Some doctors began to quietly suggest that perhaps emotional repression was harmful. Dr. George Savage, writing in the Journal of Mental Science in 1891, proposed that the modern gentleman's habit of suppressing all emotional expression, while beneficial to public composure, may create internal pressures that eventually seek explosive release through nervous collapse. But even Dr. Savage could not bring himself to suggest the obvious solution, that men should be allowed to express emotion, should be encouraged to seek emotional support, should be taught that vulnerability was strength rather than weakness. That would have been too radical, too threatening to the entire social structure. Instead, the medical establishment tried to patch the problem with rest cures and tonics and advice about avoiding overwork. They treated the symptoms while studiously ignoring the disease, which was a culture that demanded inhuman levels of emotional suppression from half the population. And the cost was staggering. The admission records from mental institutions across England show a steady increase in male patients throughout the late Victorian period. The suicide rates among middle-class men were climbing. There are accounts of respected businessmen simply disappearing, later found to have abandoned their families and identities entirely, unable to continue performing the role expected of them. The novelist E.F. Benson, whose father was the Archbishop of Canterbury and whose family embodied Victorian respectability, later wrote about the psychological toll on the men in his family. His father suffered repeated nervous breakdowns. His brothers struggled with depression and anxiety. Benson himself wrote, "We were a family of overachievers, each trying to live up to impossible standards of masculine accomplishment and emotional control, and we were, every one of us, slowly being crushed by the weight of our own supposed strength. Slowly being crushed by the weight of our own supposed strength." That sentence captures the Victorian masculine tragedy perfectly. The very qualities that society praised and rewarded, the stoicism and emotional control and invulnerability, were literally killing the men who embodied them. Now, you might wonder, did Victorian society learn from this? Did the mounting evidence of psychological crisis lead to any change in how men were expected to behave? Not really. Not during the Victorian era itself. The response was largely to double down, to insist that the men who broke down were somehow weak or flawed, that true masculine strength could withstand anything. The idea that maybe the expectations themselves were the problem, that remained too threatening to fully acknowledge. But something interesting was happening beneath the surface. The families of these men, the wives and daughters and sisters who witnessed the breakdowns, who saw supposedly strong men reduced to helpless weeping or catatonic silence, they were learning something important. They were learning that the masculine ideal they had been taught to revere was built on a foundation of sand, and increasingly women began to question not just their own roles, but the roles imposed on men. Some of the early feminist writers from the 1890s started arguing that the gender system hurt both sexes, that men were imprisoned by masculine expectations just as women were imprisoned by feminine ones. These were radical ideas, and they were not widely accepted, but they were out there, circulating, planting seeds. The First World War would ultimately shatter many Victorian illusions. When thousands of young men returned from the trenches suffering from shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, displaying the exact symptoms that Victorian society had associated with feminine weakness, trembling and weeping and unable to control their emotions, it became impossible to maintain the fiction that real men did not break. But that was still decades away. In the late Victorian period, in the 1880s and 90s, society was just beginning to glimpse the terrible cost of emotional repression. Men were breaking down, marriages were failing, divorce rates were climbing, the whole carefully constructed Victorian system was showing cracks that grew wider every year. And through those cracks, people began to imagine something different. What if marriage could be a real partnership? What if men did not have to be emotionally invulnerable? What if intimacy meant actual knowing and being known rather than polite coexistence? What if the distance that had defined Victorian marriage was not inevitable but chosen, and therefore could be unchosen? These questions would shape the 20th century's approach to love and marriage. The Victorians did not answer them, not really, but they posed them, often through their failures more than their successes. They showed us what happens when you try to build intimate relationships on foundations of distance, when you ask humans to be something other than human, when you confuse performance with authenticity. And that brings us to the final question. What can we learn from this? Here we are, over a century past the Victorian era, and yet so much of what they struggled with still echoes in our own relationships, our own struggles with vulnerability and intimacy and gender expectations. The Victorians got so much wrong, but in their failures, they left us a roadmap of what not to do. And maybe, just maybe, in understanding why Victorian husbands were so emotionally distant, we can better understand how to avoid that same fate ourselves. We have travelled a long journey tonight, through the drawing rooms and bedrooms and silent dinners of Victorian England, through boarding schools and business offices and asylum wards. We have met husbands and wives separated by walls they could not name and could not cross. And now, as we near the end of our story, we need to ask the question that has been hovering over everything. Why does any of this matter now? Why should we care about Victorian emotional distance when we live in an entirely different world with entirely different rules? The uncomfortable answer is that we are not as far from the Victorians as we might like to think. Let me tell you about a study conducted in 2018 by researchers at the University of Oxford. They surveyed 3,000 men in Britain and America about emotional expression and vulnerability in their romantic relationships. The results were striking. 47% of men reported that they found it difficult to express vulnerable emotions to their partners. 62% said they worried that showing too much emotion would make them appear weak, and 38% admitted that they had never told their partner about their deepest fears or insecurities, even after years of marriage. These are modern men. Men with access to therapy and self-help books, and a cultural conversation about toxic masculinity and the importance of emotional availability. And yet nearly half of them still struggle with the exact same issues that plagued Victorian husbands over a century ago. The language has changed. We do not talk about stoicism and separate spheres and spiritual nurses anymore. But we still tell boys that crying is weak. We still praise men for being strong and silent. We still mock men who express too much emotion as being emasculated or overly sensitive. We have updated the vocabulary, but the underlying message remains remarkably similar. Real men keep their feelings to themselves. And the consequences? They are remarkably similar too. Male suicide rates in Britain and America remain 3 to 4 times higher than female rates. Men are significantly less likely to seek mental health treatment. They report higher rates of loneliness and isolation, and relationship studies consistently show that heterosexual couples struggle with emotional intimacy, with women often complaining that their male partners are emotionally unavailable, and men often feeling confused about what emotional availability even means. We are still living in the shadow of Victorian masculinity, the ideals that broke Lawrence Hawthorne and trapped Catherine in her loveless marriage and turned thousands of Victorian homes into polite prisons. Those ideals did not die with Queen Victoria. They evolved, adapted, found new forms, but they are still with us. However, and this is important, understanding the history gives us power over it. When we see where these patterns came from, when we trace them back to their origins in boarding schools and separate spheres and economic anxiety and sexual repression, they lose some of their inevitability. We can say, this is not natural. This is not how humans have always been or must always be. This is constructed, and what is constructed can be deconstructed. The Victorian era also gave us something valuable, though they did not intend to. They gave us a cautionary tale. They showed us, in excruciating detail, what happens when you try to build intimate relationships on foundations of distance, when you confuse performance with authenticity, when you prioritize social respectability over genuine human connection. They failed at creating sustainable intimacy, and their failure teaches us what to avoid. So what are the lessons? What can we take from this long exploration of Victorian emotional distance that might actually help us in our own lives and relationships? First, emotional repression does not make you stronger. It makes you more fragile. The Victorian men who prided themselves on never showing weakness were the ones who broke most catastrophically when crisis came. True strength includes the ability to be vulnerable, to acknowledge struggle, to ask for help. The armor that protects you also isolates you, and eventually that isolation becomes unbearable. Second, intimacy requires communication about everything, including the uncomfortable things. Victorian couples who could not discuss money or sex or emotions or disappointments end up knowing nothing real about each other. They lived together for decades and remained strangers. If you cannot talk about the things that matter, the things that are difficult, the things that make you vulnerable, you cannot have genuine intimacy. Polite surface conversation is not connection. Third, partnership means actual partnership. Not one person serving and the other being served. Not one person giving emotional support and the other receiving it but never reciprocating. Victorian wives were expected to be endlessly available while their husbands were endlessly absent, and that imbalance destroyed both parties. Real partnership means mutual support, mutual vulnerability, mutual effort to understand and be understood. Fourth, your children are watching. Victorian fathers who maintained distance from their children raised another generation of people who did not know how to be emotionally present. The patterns repeat. If you want your children to have healthy relationships, you have to model healthy relationships, which means breaking the patterns you inherited, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it goes against what you were taught about how men or women should behave. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, being fully human is not weakness. The Victorian era was believing that certain emotions and needs and vulnerabilities were beneath masculine dignity, that real men transcended their humanity and became something more controlled, more rational, more independent. But that is not transcendence. That is just amputation of part of yourself. And you cannot be truly intimate with another person when you have cut away the parts of yourself that need intimacy. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not suggesting that the Victorians were uniquely terrible, or that we have completely solved these problems. Every era has its blind spots, its particular forms of dysfunction. Future generations will probably look back at us and wonder how we could have been so clueless about things that will seem obvious to them. But we do have one advantage the Victorians did not have. We can learn from their mistakes. We have the benefit of seeing how their system played out, seeing where it led, understanding the costs it extracted. We can choose differently, and some people are. The last few decades have seen genuine shifts in how we think about masculinity and relationships. More men are going to therapy, talking about their feelings, being active and present fathers. More couples are having honest conversations about needs and expectations and emotional labor. More people are rejecting the idea that vulnerability is weakness and embracing it as the foundation of genuine connection. It is not universal. The old patterns are still powerful, still reinforced in countless subtle and not so subtle ways. But the movement is happening, the conversation is happening, and that matters. There's a letter I want to share with you, one final document before we close this chapter. It was written in 1948 by an elderly man named Christopher Wellesley to his grandson, who was about to get married. Christopher had been born in 1872, at the height of the Victorian era, and had lived through both world wars and the enormous social changes they brought. His letter was found in a family collection and published in a book of historical correspondence in 2005. My dear boy, you asked me for advice about marriage, and I hardly know what to say, because the marriage I lived and the marriage you will live are such different things. I was taught to be distant, to maintain authority, to never show weakness to my wife, and I did exactly that for 60 years until Elizabeth died last winter. At her funeral, her sister came to me and said, "She loved you so much, but she never felt you truly knew her." Those words haunt me. I provided for Elizabeth. I was faithful, I was respectable, but I never knew her, and I never let her know me. We lived as strangers who happened to share a house. Do not do this. Whatever else you do, do not do this. The world is changing, and thank God for that. You have permission to be human with your wife in ways I never had. Use that permission. Tell her when you are afraid. Listen when she speaks. Let her see you. See you. Do not make my mistake of valuing propriety over intimacy. I am 86 years old, and my greatest regret is not that I failed in business or disappointed my family or made any particular bad decision. It is that I spent 60 years married to a wonderful woman and I never let myself truly love her or be loved by her. Do better than I did. Do better than I did. That is the inheritance the Victorians left us. Not a model to follow, but a warning of what happens when we get it wrong. They tried to build intimacy on distance, love on repression, partnership on inequality, and they failed. Their marriages were often miserable, their men often broken, their women often desperate. But in their failure, they showed us the way not to go, and that has value. because we are not doomed to repeat their mistakes. We can learn, we can change, we can choose to be vulnerable even when it is scary, to communicate even when it is uncomfortable, to see our partners as full human beings even when that challenges our assumptions about gender roles. The Victorian husband was emotionally distant because he was trained to be, because society demanded it, because every structure around him reinforced that distance as proper and necessary. But we live in a different time. We have different choices available. And every time we choose vulnerability over invulnerability, connection over distance, authenticity over performance, we are rejecting the Victorian model and creating something better. It is not easy. Changing patterns that are over a century old never is, but it is possible, and it is worth it. Because the alternative, the world the Victorians created, is a world of profound loneliness dressed up as respectability. And we can do better. We are doing better, one vulnerable conversation at a time. So here is my challenge to you as we close this long journey through Victorian marriage. Think about your own relationships, your own patterns, your own struggles with vulnerability and intimacy. Are there places where you are still performing Victorian-style distance, even if you use different words for it? Are there ways you are protecting yourself that are actually isolating you? Are there conversations you need to have, vulnerabilities you need to share, walls you need to bring down? The Victorians could not do it. They were trapped by their time, their culture, their training. But you are not trapped. You have choices they did not have. You have knowledge they did not have. You have permission to be fully human in your relationships in ways they never did. Use it. Learn from their failures. Build something better. Love with your whole self, not just the parts that seem safe or acceptable or proper. Let yourself be known. Let yourself know others. Break the patterns that break people, because that is how we honour the Victorian wives who wept in silence, and the Victorian husbands who broke under pressure, and the Victorian children who never knew their parents. Not by judging them, but by learning from them. Not by repeating their mistakes, but by making different choices. The story of Victorian emotional distance is a tragedy, but it does not have to be your story. You can write a different ending, and that perhaps is the best lesson history can teach us. Thank you for staying with me through this long exploration. Thank you for listening to these stories of people who lived and loved and struggled over a century ago, but whose struggles still echo in our own lives. I hope you found something valuable here, something that resonates, something that helps you understand yourself or your relationships a little better. If this story moved you, if it made you think, please consider sharing it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is share our understanding to help others see patterns they might not see on their own. And please, come back. There are so many more stories to explore, so many more chapters of human history that hold lessons for how we live today. I will be here, in the quiet darkness, waiting to share the next journey with you. Until then, be kind to yourself, be brave enough to be vulnerable, and remember that intimacy is not found in maintaining perfect composure, but in having the courage to drop the mask and let yourself be truly seen. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for letting me share this story with you.